Good evening. It's Thursday, the 28th of April. Our top stories tonight. Sweden and Finland's membership of NATO could be fast-tracked as Moscow threatens to deploy nuclear weapons closer to their borders. The two prisoners at the centre of a US-Russia swap deal are back on home soil. Indian firefighters struggling to contain a massive landfill fire during a scorching Delhi heatwave. And a new survey shows a majority of Australians want the government to be tougher on China. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Beverly O'Connor. Also tonight, a landmark court case in Fiji sees a Chinese developer fined for damaging pristine coral reefs. Well, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says Finland and Sweden will be able to join NATO quickly should they decide to ask for membership in the Western military alliance. Russia has said it'll deploy nuclear weapons and hypersonic missiles in its Baltic enclave of Kaliningrad if the countries decide to join NATO. But Mr. Stoltenberg says Sweden and Finland will be welcomed with open arms, regardless of threats from Moscow.
So when Russia tries in a way to threaten, to intimidate Finland and Sweden from not applying, it just demonstrates how Russia is not respecting the basic right of every nation to choose its own path. So we are in dialogue with Finland and Sweden, and it's their decision. But if they decide to apply, Finland and Sweden will be warmly welcomed and expect the process to go quickly.
Vladimir Putin has also warned of lightning-fast retaliation if any country directly interferes in Ukraine. Ukraine has reported an escalation of Russia's eastern offensive as its allies have stepped up support of heavy weaponry and equipment, with the first Australian-made armoured vehicles deployed on the front line.
In central Kiev, the wives of soldiers trapped hundreds of kilometres away in Mariupol call out to the world for help.
Join the corridor in Mariupol.
The southeast port city is now under Moscow's control.
We want the European community to help release our husbands. We need heroes who are alive, not dead.
Another desperate plea has been issued from inside the factory, which continues to be shelled by Russian forces.
We have more than 600 injured in our group. We have neither the conditions nor the medications, and no personnel who can help them.
Ukraine's allies have committed to sending more heavy weapons to support the country's fighting forces, including Australian Bushmaster armoured vehicles, which have already been deployed. President Vladimir Putin has issued a stark warning to the West that direct intervention will not be tolerated.
If someone intends to intervene, they should know that our retaliatory strikes will be lightning fast. We have the tools for this, things no one else can boast of having.
Moscow has turned off the gas to Bulgaria and Poland. Ukraine's allies say it amounts to weaponising energy supplies.
Both Poland and Bulgaria are now receiving gas from their EU neighbours. And this shows, first of all, the immense solidarity among us. The era of Russian fossil fuel in Europe is coming to an end.
But economic pressure is struggling to put out the flames of Vladimir Putin's war. Towns like Moshun outside Kiev have already experienced the full force of a Russian attack. The damage to this village is so widespread that from the ground it almost looks like a bushfire or a cyclone's been through here. But from above you can get a better sense of what's happened. Hundreds of massive shells have rained down on this town, creating huge craters in the ground like this one. The buildings that took a direct hit were obliterated. Most civilians got out of here, but great-grandmother Lydia Zeka didn't have time. She showed us the cellar where she hid while the shells came down around her. She'd been preserving food in advance. You ate all this while you were down here? At least if I died, I'd die with a full stomach, she said. When the guns fell silent, she emerged to find her village empty and in ruins.
After a month, I came out of hiding. I saw the houses around me were bombed and burnt. The fire was spreading from one house to another, and then I realised I was all alone.
Lydia doesn't want to leave her home. It's been her refuge for the past 2 months, but no one's joining her here anytime soon. Nick Dole, ABC News, Moshun.
And we'll talk more with military strategist Mick Ryan shortly. A former US Marine released from a Russian jail as part of a surprise prisoner swap deal has arrived back home. Trevor Reed was arrested in 2019 for allegedly assaulting police in Moscow. In exchange, a Russian pilot serving 20 years on drug smuggling charges has been reunited with his family. Here's Manny Tsigas.
On a Moscow airfield, a frail Trevor Reed takes his final steps on Russian soil, nearly 1,000 days following his arrest.
I mean, we're excited. We know he's on the plane, but I think we're really it's gonna really hit us when we get to put our arms around him and hug him.
Reed was flown to Turkey in exchange for Konstantin Yaroshenko, whose 20-year sentence for smuggling cocaine into the US was commuted, a prisoner swap that would have been a huge feat in times of peace, let alone as US-Russian relations plunged to an all-time low.
Thanks to the support of my wife, my daughter and my God, I went through all these things and I didn't fall apart. It was a very difficult 12 years. I didn't believe I'd be released right up until the last moment.
In 2019, Reed had travelled to Moscow to visit his girlfriend, but on a drunken night out he was detained by police and accused of assaulting 2 officers as they drove him to the station. Reed pleaded not guilty, saying he had no recollection, but he was sentenced to 9 years jail.
It's all-consuming, it really is, and it's just been hard, and you have to keep functioning.
Reed's parents say the Marine had been treated poorly in prison and appeared to have contracted tuberculosis. Last month, the couple protested outside the White House, ultimately securing a meeting with the president. Joe Biden has since hailed Reed's release, but didn't elaborate on how it came to be.
I did it.
How?
Thank you.
Thank you.
3 months ago.
We're so thankful for President Biden meeting with us and then taking this swift action after meeting with him. We believe that he probably saved our son's life.
The fate of other Americans detained in Russia remains unclear. The White House says while the swap focused on a discrete set of prisoner issues, it does not signal a broader diplomatic dialogue with Russia or a change in approach on Ukraine. Manny Tsigas, ABC News.
Firefighters in India's capital are struggling to put out a blaze at a landfill that's been burning for 3 days. Flames have engulfed the Balswas waste dumper in New Delhi amid extreme heat and low visibility. Locals say the amount of smoke being emitted has made it impossible for anyone to stand near it. The cause of the fire is under investigation, but incidents like this are common during India's summer, with temperatures soaring past 40 degrees. And a massive fire has lit up the night sky near Brazil's largest airport. Fire officials say the blaze began in a warehouse for household items near Guarulhos International Airport before spreading to neighbouring sheds. Videos show thick smoke and huge flames rising from the buildings. Firefighters said one person was taken to hospital for smoke inhalation. Well, this week's shock inflation figure is forcing the major parties to defend their plans to bring down the cost of living. At more than 5%, inflation's at a 20-year high, meaning the Reserve Bank is all but certain to increase the official cash rate as early as next week. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn, who takes a look at what both major parties claim will help ease the pressure on households.
Who wants to read this book?
Labor says tackling the rising cost of living begins with supervised child play.
Labor's childcare policy will reduce those cost pressures on families.
Now we're going to build a little go-kart. You ready?
More affordable childcare, bringing not only a financial benefit,
saving an average family $1,600 a year,
but allowing parents to work more hours, which the Shadow Treasurer says is key to tackling the combination of shrinking real wages, higher inflation and rising interest rates.
Australians are getting absolutely slaughtered by this triple whammy.
Cheaper childcare part of Labor's wage and cost of living plan, along with cutting power bills by investing in cheaper and cleaner energy, fee-free TAFE and university training for higher paid jobs, regulating the gig economy and supporting minimum wage cases, especially in aged care.
There is no magic pen that enables you to write a letter to somebody which all of a sudden sees wages go up.
The Coalition still hailing its budget cost of living package.
Designed to grow our economy, to create more jobs and to put more money into people's pockets.
A 6-month halving of fuel excise, reducing the pump price by 22 cents a litre, a $250 payment to pensioners and concession card holders rolling out this week, and from July 1, a $1,500 tax offset for 10 million low and middle income earners.
They will get effectively a tax hike when the low and middle income tax offset runs out.
But Labor doesn't intend extending the tax offset either, so that effective tax hike is coming whoever wins on May 21.
Liberal and Labor are taking pot shots at each other, but neither of them have got a plan to tackle the cost of living crisis.
But soon, Australians will have to decide who they entrust the economy to for the next 3 years. Scott Morrison continuing to urge voters to stick with the one you know in troubled times.
We're in the middle of a global pandemic with a war in Europe.
The war in Ukraine doesn't explain or excuse a decade of this mob going after people's wages and job security.
Can either side stop the squeeze on households? Of course not. One-off payments are one-off, temporary measures are temporary, and Labor's childcare plan would take many months to bed down. And in that time, interest rates will have risen considerably, with next week's expected rise likely the first of several back-to-back rate hikes. As for wage growth, no one has solved the modern mystery as to why it remains stubbornly low, even in an era of low unemployment. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, a raid by Israeli soldiers in the West Bank has again turned deadly after a Palestinian man was shot and killed after clashes erupted overnight. Israel has stepped up what it calls counter-terrorism activities in the contested territory after a string of attacks in which 14 people were killed. I'm joined out of Jerusalem by co-founder and executive director of the Media Line, Michael Freitz. And Michael, good to talk again. What has sparked this latest spike in violence?
It doesn't need much to spike of violence in the Middle East. It's a kinder tag, or whatever you want to call it. This particular episode began with another. If you ask the Israelis, it was the shooting of civilians. If you ask the Palestinians, it was unwarranted entry into their turf. The Palestinians have become very aggressive. They've become very vocal in warning the Israelis that they've collected a rather large cache of weapons. They're willing to use them. They're not going to give a pass to the Israelis. Just about any incursion by the Israelis will be met by a violent eruption, and that they're living up to their word and everybody is doing it. The Israelis, however, were really stung by this. The 14 people dead in such a short period of time really, really hit home. So the undercover agents who really fight the war against terror, against the civilian population, have been out in great force.
Yeah. You know, it is interesting, but there had been a while before these sort of random attacks were happening on Israeli citizens. Is it a sense that you get that the Palestinians, as you put it, are not going to continue to suffer from what they say are the injustices of the way they are living?
Well, there are a lot of Palestinians who are believing that the government has to go. And part of this is a show to put on pressure to Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, a resonating cheer that you got to go, you're in your 80s, you know, you've been in office for 10, 15 times longer than you were elected for, it's time to get new blood. This is going to shake up the landscape. It also is a play, you have the lone wolf type events being interspersed with the more organized events. And the more organized events are part of that message that's being sent that, hey, we're still here. We Palestinians haven't been put on the side because of the Abraham Accords. We're not put on the side because our time has passed, that we're not doing anything. Maybe the leadership isn't, and therefore we're going to shake it up, so leadership has to be responsive.
Is there any obvious successor?
Yes and no, like in any election. There are people close to Mahmoud Abbas. There are people who have been in exile for a number of years. There are people who will come from just about out of nowhere to get to where they have to be. It'll be an interesting election period if the election ever really comes.
Yeah, indeed. The holy month of Ramadan is drawing to a close in a few days. This typically also escalates tensions, does it not?
Oh, absolutely. It's a time for tensions. Again, when the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, is getting the attention that it gets during Ramadan, you have masses and masses of people squeezed together in a very short area. And the Palestinians have made it clear that they don't like they call for the status quo, but there's parts of the status quo ante that they're not accepting. And a lot of triggers to the violence are occurring, and much, much less effort than before, almost as if everybody wants to see the conflagration and see where afterwards we see the pieces fall.
Yeah. Let's come closer to Israel, and the Prime Minister is coming in for a fair bit of criticism. He's been racking up fairly hefty bills, $26,000 a month. Now, of course, this is at his private residence because he chose to continue living there as Prime Minister, did he not?
He certainly did. And it's interesting, too. Israelis have made an art form out of trashing the Prime Minister about what's on his table, what's in his refrigerator, and what flavor ice cream he uses. They had a lot of years under Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife that they love to pick on. It's honed into an art form. Now, Naftali Bennett is a self-made millionaire. He's got lots and lots of money. He sold his startups for $200-something million. He can afford dinner. And he pointed out to the nation the other night that his dinners are half the cost of the Netanyahu dinners, but he's going to pay his own way now. He's not going to accept the government money to pay for his food anymore. It's kind of comic relief, but these are the little seeds that just gnarl at you and grow into something bigger.
Yeah, it seems, as you point out, that it's a national sport. But how would you judge how this uneasy coalition government is travelling so far?
Well, it's still there, which has amazed a lot of people. To have so many voices trying to sing the same tune is not an easy task. What's breaking up now is not surprising, but whether the fact that it's held together even after the initial troubles have set in is pretty impressive. And it's possible it could actually make it into the next phase of this coalition government.
Yeah, it should be interesting. Lovely to chat as always. Thanks, Michael.
A pleasure. Good to see you.
Well, it's not unusual for national security to be debated in an election campaign, but China's recent move into the Pacific has put Australia's poor relations with Beijing front and centre. So what does that mean in the super marginal electorate of Chisholm, held by the Liberals by just 0.5%, and where 1 in 5 voters is Chinese-Australian? The ABC's Jason Fang took a look.
When campaigning in Box Hill, it's handy to have a former prime minister who also happens to speak Mandarin. But it's also a reminder that not everyone lives and breathes politics. At the last election, it was a battle between 2 Chinese-Australian candidates.
Very nice to meet you.
Gladys Liu won by just 0.5%. This time, there is a new non-Chinese Labour candidate.
All I can do is work as hard as I possibly can.
But there is another big difference at this election. For the first time, Australia's relations with China are front and centre of the campaign.
Why would you take China's side?
Well, that's an outrageous slur.
The only way that you can preserve peace is to prepare for war.
So what does that mean in an electorate where 1 in 5 voters are Chinese-Australian?
What we've found here on the ground is that all these folks who are voting, they're Australians first.
经济，对经济比较重要。
现在的话，感觉政策上的话，还是不是说特别优惠，就是对很多的商业移民来说。
But China's move into the Pacific region is clearly worrying some.
对这个，我觉得这个话题有点敏感，所以说我目前不会做任何的一些评论。
This man is worried for his family in Hong Kong and does not want to be identified.
When Peter Dutton says we need to be prepared to war, is that over the top?
I'll say no, because if we are not prepared, we can't rely on other countries, say the US, to protect us.
Others are much more relaxed.
不是特别感兴趣，因为每个人就是不同的人有不同的见解吧，就是我们就只是活在当下吧。
We are all here for peace.
Chinese Australians are just like all Australians. What we care about is the economy, the jobs, the health.
Dr. Lu Xinlu lives in Chisholm and says Chinese language media in Australia is talking about similar issues.
The inflation, the house prices, the aged care, the immigration.
And like the rest of the country, there are those who wish it was all over.
They're very divisive, this type of election campaign. I really don't like the way the politics goes.
Jason Fang, ABC News, Box Hill.
The former US President Donald Trump is appealing a US judge's contempt of court ruling over his failure to hand over key documents. Mr. Trump is facing a fine of over $10,000 for every day he doesn't comply. Mr. Trump didn't hand over information about his real estate holdings relating to a civil investigation launched 3 years ago. In Fiji, a Chinese resort company has been fined 650,000 Australian dollars for unauthorised developments and destroying extensive parts of a sensitive reef. The fine was handed down by the Suva High Court against the company Freesol, which had been planning a multi-million-dollar resort on the island of Malolo. Journalist Lithe Mavona was in court for the sentencing. She says the outcome is unprecedented in Fiji.
This is the first environmental crime that's been successfully prosecuted and convicted in a Fijian court. So this is most definitely a precedent, and one that conservationists and I'm sure our government environmental authorities are very happy about, because it means that they can continue to now prosecute people who breach our Environmental Management Act.
So tell us a little bit about what this company had intended to build.
Well, the resort, it was being put together by Freesol Limited, a corporation with very close links to China, and had elaborate plans for a multi-million-dollar property on the island of Malolo. Malolo is in the Mamanuca groups, one of Fiji's tourism hotspots, and most definitely a jewel in Fiji's tourism crown. This particular case has been controversial from the start. It was brought to light through the efforts of surfers, Australian surfers, if I'm not mistaken, who joined forces with local indigenous landowners who realized that a lot of the development works being conducted by Freesol Limited was on the marine environment in the area. And this is something that the local travel industry holds very dearly, given that our travel industry depends on our pristine and beautiful environment, and also for the livelihoods of our communities. So it was a New Zealand media organization who published stories about the struggles that the landowners and these surfer property owners had, which brought things to light. It's been filled with a lot of controversy because there was criminal intimidation, there was some difficulty getting the government bureaucracy to work to their favor, but I think it's an all's well that ends well situation now, Beverly.
Yeah. It has also, Lithe, been alleged that they've done a lot of damage to those very precious reefs and that pristine environmental area. Will they be required to clean this up?
They most definitely will. The sentence handed down today for $1 million is for Freesol Limited to provide this to Fiji's Department of Environment, who are expected to then supervise the rehabilitation works that will take place on Malolo Island. The Department of Environment had submitted in the prosecution's case that the damage done by Freesol Limited on the local reef ecosystem, as well as kilometers of mangrove natural forests is to the value of Fijian 500,000 or thereabouts. And so this $1 million is expected to do some of the rehabilitation work that the government thinks is necessary. However, the government did say that the damage done by Free Soul Limited cannot be reversed.
What does this tell us about the future of these kind of developments and the relationship between the Fijian government and authorities and Chinese developers?
Well, I think this case has shown what public pressure and what ordinary people can do when they care about the environment. Because while the Environmental Management Act of Fiji has been around for over 15 years or so, it hasn't really had any teeth. But this precedent, the judgment as well as the sentencing, means that Fijian authorities can now prosecute quite successfully those who do permanent damage to the environment of Fiji. And so what this means is that there will be very detailed scrutiny on those development organizations or companies, rather, who would like to build tourist ventures in Fiji.
And how does the local community that fought so hard feel about this outcome?
Very happy, Beverly. They have been fighting for this particular outcome for a while. Now, bear in mind that this is only the criminal case. This does open up avenues for local landowners on Malolo, as well as maybe other landowners of precious Fijian resources, to consider civil suit against those property developers who make permanent damage on Fiji's beautiful environment.
Yeah, and it should also be said that many of the journalists, including yourself, faced a lot of intimidation and intense pressure during the reporting of this case.
That's right. There's been a lot of controversy around it. Just trying to get this story out into the public arena as journalists has been difficult. We had our New Zealand colleagues come in here and get followed by, some people closely connected to Free Soul Limited. They were taken away and arrested and then kept overnight without charge. And in fact, if it wasn't for the Prime Minister saying in a parliament session that he intends to protect freedom of expression and freedom of the media, and therefore would see to the release of these New Zealand journalists, things might not have gone the way it has. Local journalists from all across the Fijian media who have tried to uncover the details of this environmental crime have themselves been chased from the island. Those of us who tried to cover the case of the New Zealanders being arrested without cause have been harassed as well. So to see this happen the way it has, it's almost like a David and Goliath situation, really.
Yeah, so such an important outcome and excellent reporting as well. Thanks for chatting to us, Letho.
Manaka.
A Sydney court has heard that a former elite soldier giving evidence for Ben Roberts-Smith attended a costume party in Afghanistan as a Ku Klux Klan member. The former soldier has supported the war veteran's account of a mission at the centre of his defamation trial. Mr. Roberts-Smith is suing 3 newspapers over stories that reported alleged war crimes.
Ben Roberts-Smith's friendships with ex-colleagues are becoming a line of attack. A former soldier codenamed Person 35 has given evidence backing up his account of a mission at a Taliban compound where it's alleged 2 prisoners were executed. The court heard the witness dressed as a white supremacist at an unofficial soldier bar for a 2012 party shown in photographs published last year. I knew one other person was coming in blackface, so I thought it would be funny, the witness said, adding that it was just a parody, just to make fun of the actual clan itself. Asked whether he was reprimanded, he said, "No, I was not. I actually won the fancy dress competition that night." Mr. Roberts-Smith is suing 9 Entertainment over articles that contained what he says are false and defamatory allegations of unlawful killings, bullying and domestic violence. Under cross-examination, Person 35's Instagram activity became ammunition. He agreed that before coming to court, he clicked like on a post suggesting the defamation case involved some fuckwit in a suit questioning your integrity, and has previously liked posts labelling Nine's witnesses as rats and snitches. "I consider your client's witnesses to be lying," he said. Nicholas Owens SC suggested Person 35 was an utterly partisan witness whose friendship with Ben Roberts-Smith is so strong he'd never say anything that might damage the war veteran's interests. The witness denied that and said he's told the truth. Jamie McKinnell, ABC News, Sydney.
The northern English city of York is cutting ties with Prince Andrew, stripping him of an honour. Local councillors voted unanimously in favour of taking away his freedom of the city and also called for him to relinquish the title of Duke of York. It comes after Prince Andrew settled a US lawsuit with Virginia Giuffre, who accused him of sexually abusing her while she was a teenager. A mega raptor with blade-like claws that lived around 70 million years ago has been discovered in southern Argentina. The dinosaur, known as Maep macrothorax, is believed to have been up to 10 metres tall and weighing about 5 tonnes. The fossils were found in Argentina's Santa Cruz province in 2020. They are so well preserved they can give detailed insights into the formation of the dinosaur's muscles and ligaments. Our top stories tonight on the world. Vladimir Putin has warned of lightning-fast retaliation if any country directly interferes in Ukraine, a threat widely seen as a reference to ballistic and nuclear missiles. A former US Marine released from a Russian jail as part of a surprise prisoner swap deal has arrived back home. And firefighters in India's capital struggle to put out a blaze at a landfill that has been burning for 3 days now. Well, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has toured towns in Ukraine's Kyiv region that were shelled during Russia's early offensive in the north. While visiting the obliterated neighbourhoods, Mr. Guterres said civilians were paying the highest price in the war. The bodies of over 1,100 civilians have been recovered in Ukraine's Kyiv region since Russia's invasion. More than half have bullet wounds from small arms. Guterres also toured the town of Bucha, where hundreds of corpses have been discovered since Russian forces withdrew. Moscow has denied targeting civilians. Well, let's get more on the Ukraine situation. I'm joined by David Dunn, Professor of International Politics at the University of Birmingham. David, good to have you with us tonight. What do you make of these threats by Vladimir Putin against Finland and Sweden, as both countries are weighing up whether to push for NATO membership?
This is entirely in line with the Russian and Putin's playbook. He's, as well as conducting an invasion of Ukraine, he's also engaged in an information war, trying to use bluster and threats to divide the West, to make uncomfortable his opponents, and to try and get them to back down as a consequence of these statements that he's making.
How serious do you think he is about contemplating using nuclear weapons, for example?
Well, the Russians have in their strategy the idea of escalate to de-escalate, the idea that they would use nuclear weapons first in any conflict in order to actually make their opponent take stock and to back down. And therefore, that's part of the psychological game that Russia is playing. But nuclear weapons have no military utility in this war with Ukraine. Their political consequences would outweigh any military benefit that they would have. And actually, Russia has enough long-range conventional weapons to actually have the effects that they wanted to do, unless the intent was to make a political statement or to kill large numbers of civilians, which is what they would do. So actually, the NATO countries, by and large, are not taking these things as an indication of intent, and more a question of trying to psychologically bludgeon their opponents into submission or into stopping supporting the Ukrainians. And that's not what's about to happen. And in actual fact, the West has become more assertive in its support for Ukraine. And there's 3 reasons for that. There's partly the outrages of what the Russians have done and killing civilians and the war crimes. And secondly, how well the Ukrainians have done themselves. And actually, the fact that initially the West was prepared to support them in a guerrilla war, but actually their army has held up. And because of that, it needs different weapons than the weapons supplied to fight a guerrilla war. And thirdly, actually, the West has seen how bad the Russians have been, and therefore realised that their military is potentially defeatable, and therefore there's a game to be played in terms of supplying weapons to the Ukrainians to blunt their attack and perhaps even to turn around this aggression.
Yeah. Ukraine has tonight said that the world recognises the country has the right to defend itself by carrying out attacks on Russian military bases and warehouses. But within Russia, is this a dangerous step, do you think, for the Ukrainians to take?
It does represent an escalation. The Ukrainians initially were targeting forces just in Ukraine. But again, as the war moves to a different phase, it makes more sense militarily to attack fuel dumps and ammunition dumps and railheads and other targets inside Russia. And there's also a psychological aspect to this. Actually, Russia has so far done all the fighting in Ukraine. Russia needs to recognize that one of the consequences of its aggression against Ukraine is that this war can come home, as well as the dead Russian troops that Russia has to accept. There's also the prospect of escalation involving attacks in Russia. And the fact that the Ukrainian military are able to do this without being taken down in their attempts of using air power helicopters against fuel dumps and the like, was also a message of just how successful Ukraine has been in rebutting the Russian attack.
Yeah. Let's talk too, though, about Ukraine saying tonight that Russia has really intensified its offensive in the east, with several towns coming under intense attack. Does this indicate to you that Russia has now regrouped itself and enough forces to start this more strategic part of their plan?
Absolutely. What we're seeing is a different phase of the war. The Russians thought they could just drive in and take Kiev, and they didn't need to do that with even the number of forces they had gathered in Belarus. And instead, what they're doing now is reverting to a different type of warfare, long-range artillery, tank formations, and they plan to sweep through the plains of the Donbass region and take more territory, and the annexation of large parts of the country. And they're doing it at a different pace and in a different style, using a war of attrition to do that, rather than just driving down the main road towards Ukraine, which they did in the initial phase of the war. So this will be one that will be probably the biggest tank battle we've seen since the Second World War. It will be a war of attrition. It will be a war that's quite devastating to those areas and to the towns in those areas. And that's partly why the West, the Americans, even the Germans are supplying armored vehicles to the Ukrainians, recognizing that actually to be able to rebut that attack requires a different level of response from Ukraine's armed forces and indeed its allies.
Yeah. UN Chief Antonio Guterres, though, has said that this war will not end until Russia decides to end it. Is that your sense, and what would have to happen for Putin to stop or even retreat?
There's two aspects to that. I mean, this is a war of choice by Vladimir Putin. It is his choice to invade another sovereign country and to impose the barbaric practices that they have done. And it's also the choice of the Ukrainians, in contrast to the Afghans, to actually fight and to make a fight of it. And it may well be the case that at some point Vladimir Putin will say, okay, this war has ended. I have taken back territory. I have destroyed Ukraine, and that's enough for me. But that may not be enough to stop the Ukrainians wanting to gain back the territory they have lost and to avenge the aggression that Putin has put on them. So it takes two to fight, and even if the Russians stop, doesn't necessarily mean the Ukrainians will.
Yeah. David, really great to get your perspective on some of these developments today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Well, the Chief of Australia's Air Force has signed an MOU with Papua New Guinea's Defence Chief as part of an ongoing program to rebuild the country's air unit. It comes in the wake of the security deal signed between Solomon Islands and China, which has sparked concerns about regional security in the Pacific. Our PNG correspondent Natalie Whiting has more.
After years of being unable to fly, the air arm of PNG's Defence Force is getting back on its feet and back into the skies. Members of Australia's Air Force have been in the country since last year, working to help with plane maintenance and staff training. This week, the Chief of the Royal Australian Air Force, Air Marshal Mel Hupfeld, was in the country and signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the Chief of PNG's Defence Force as part of the ongoing program. Given PNG's rugged and remote terrain, air transport is incredibly important here, and the country's Defence Force Chief says he's proud and happy to see this work happening. It's long been a goal for PNG to reinvigorate its air transport wing, and in recent years it attracted support from Australia.
I think certainly our focus has been into other parts of the world, but our government's made it very clear it's important that we recognise the significance of our region, the security of our region. But what's important is that the PNGDF make their own choices about their security and their sovereignty. What I'd like to do as the Chief of Air Force is to be in a position to help.
Both Australia and the US increased their defence involvement in PNG back in 2018, notably with a plan to help redevelop the Lombrum Naval Base on Manus, in what was seen as a pushback against increased interest from China. That redevelopment work is ongoing, but has faced some delays, including the US being slow to the table after announcing its intention to be involved. In the wake of the recent Solomon Islands-China security deal, both the US and Australia are again looking to strengthen ties with PNG. The US says it will be having further discussions on that after a recent brief visit by a high-level delegation.
Well, US is a very big country. They have got, a very big appetite, I must say, and they visited because of, as you said about what's happening in Solomon Islands. Yes, we had some discussions. We shared some views on how we see the security should look like within the region.
On Solomon Islands, PNG's Defence Chief says he respects their sovereignty.
They make the decisions based on their security needs, and we respect that, as close neighbours. And we will allow that, to be discussed at, political level. All we want to see within the region is to ensure there's peace and security.
For his part, the Chief of the Royal Australian Air Force wasn't keen to weigh in on the potential security implications of Solomon Islands' deal with China, or on the recent ominous call from the Australian Defence Minister that Australia must prepare for war, saying they were comments for politicians to make.
The ABC's Vote Compass survey has just today released data on what the broader electorate is saying about our relations with China. It shows Australians support a tougher stance in our dealings and more investment in foreign aid and defence spending. Here's Bridget Brennan.
Australia's increasingly heated relationship with China has become a focal point of the campaign. Foreign policy and our influence in the Pacific is now a key measure of effective leadership alongside domestic issues. Vote Compass asked whether you think Australia should take a tougher stance when dealing with China. More than half of Australians want our government to take a stronger position on China. That reflects a relatively robust view across party lines, but it was coalition voters who strongly agreed that Australia should take a more strident approach when dealing with China. But about a quarter of voters were neutral on the question of how to manage our increasingly fraught relationship with China.
We know that the Australian public has soured on China. There isn't really a public mood for significant change in the relationship with China.
Our level of foreign aid, especially towards our Pacific neighbours, has also been in the headlines after the Solomon Islands signed a security arrangement with China. When Vote Compass asked how much Australia should spend on foreign aid, 45% of voters told us there could be somewhat more or even much more spent on foreign aid. Labor and Greens voters were more likely to support increased aid, but most Liberal National voters disagreed, saying the current foreign aid budget was about right or could be less.
And certainly these results show to me that there's a lot more room for the Australian government to be ambitious on the development program.
And on the question of defence spending, around a third of you told Vote Compass that current defence spending is about right. Close to 40% of voters said it could be higher. Perhaps an indication that Australians are becoming increasingly more alert to our position in what could be a volatile region. To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
Police in Peru have used tear gas to disperse an Indigenous community that set up camp at a Chinese-owned copper mine. Vision shows residents of the Fuera Bamba community fleeing the Las Bambas mine as tear gas billows throughout the area. Others are seen clashing with police and then sustaining injuries. Earlier this month, protesters had entered the mine owned by China's MMG Limited, demanding what they say is their ancestral lands. Peru's government declared a state of emergency in the area, even suspending the right to protest. After stopping production, the mine warned it was planning to forcefully evict the protesters. Investigators in the UK have visited the offices of British businessman Sanjeev Gupta over a money laundering and fraud probe. Mr Gupta's global group of companies, GFG Alliance, owns the Whyalla Steel Works in South Australia and Bell Bay Smelter in northern Tasmania. The group's major lender, Greensill Capital, collapsed in April 2021, with the UK's Serious Fraud Office launching its investigation the following month.
While we naturally have an eye on what's happening overseas, we're hoping and expecting that the way that it's being handled at this end means that there'll be no negative impact for Whyalla at all.
A GFG Alliance spokesperson says the company denies any suggestion of wrongdoing and the inquiries only relate to some of the organisation's UK and French operations. Well, the High Court in London has ruled that government policies on discharging patients from hospitals to care homes at the start of the pandemic were unlawful. The ruling was made after two women took legal action against Public Health England and the Health Secretary at the time. They said COVID patients were discharged from hospitals back to care homes without testing, causing a shocking death toll.
Two women determined to hold the government to account for what they believe was its failure to protect their fathers at the start of the pandemic. Both men lived in care homes. Today, the High Court ruled policies around the discharge of hospital patients into care homes were unlawful. Dr. Kathy Gardner's father, Michael Gibson, died with COVID in early April 2020. She was shocked that hospital patients had been discharged into his care home without clear guidance on infection control. She's relieved by today's ruling.
I hope it will make a difference by ensuring that this can never happen again. Also, that the people responsible really understand that they are being held to account, that the decisions they made were wrong, that they not only put people's lives at risk, but almost certainly actually cost lives.
Faye Harris, whose father Don also died with COVID soon after hospital patients were moved into his care home, sees this case as the last thing she was able to do for him.
We left him there healthy, fit, happy. The last photo I have of him in his chair smiling because we were watching the TV, and he has just disappeared and no one is answerable. And someone has to answer the questions, how could it be allowed to happen?
This was a complicated case examining a number of laws and policies, but in the end the judgment was very clear about the decision to discharge hospital patients into care homes at the start of the pandemic. It concludes it was unlawful and irrational.
Today's judgment says early in the pandemic there was growing awareness that people could spread the virus without showing symptoms. It sets out what was known about COVID-19 at the time, as well as very early discussions by government advisers. On March the 9th, 2020, the Health Minister Lord Bethell told Parliament that large numbers of people are infectious but completely asymptomatic. And on the 13th, the Chief Scientific Advisor said some degree of asymptomatic transmission was likely. A few days later, official guidance was published on the discharge of patients from hospitals to care homes. The aim was to free up beds for the wave of COVID patients.
Right from the start, we've tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes.
Despite such reassurances, the ruling says there was no evidence that ministers considered or were asked to consider the risk asymptomatic transmission posed to care homes. And that angers the families in the case.
It is also now clear that Matt Hancock's claim that the government threw a protective ring around care homes in the first wave of the pandemic was nothing more than a despicable lie
of which he ought to be ashamed and for which he ought to apologise.
In response to the judgment, the former Health and Care Secretary said that the now abolished Public Health England failed to tell him about asymptomatic transmission. The Prime Minister also faced questions.
The thing that we didn't know in particular, Mr. Speaker, was that COVID could be transmitted asymptomatically in the way that it was. And that was something that I wish we had known more about at the time.
The government says every death is a tragedy and that it's put billions of pounds into providing care services with protective equipment and support with infection control.
The European Union is changing how it manages coronavirus, saying it has entered a post-emergency phase of the pandemic. The shift means mass reporting of case numbers in the EU will be scrapped. An estimated 60 to 80% of the EU's population has been infected.
We are entering, however, a new phase of the pandemic and a new phase that requires us to rethink of how we manage this virus. And this is why we are today presenting a new approach and are setting out actions that help us to look ahead and move from an emergency to a more sustainable management of the pandemic.
The US President Joe Biden led tributes to the former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, describing her as a force for good during an address at her funeral service in Washington. Leaders past and present turned out to farewell Ms. Albright, who was the country's first female top diplomat. In European soccer, Liverpool has taken a 2-0 lead from the first leg of the Champions League semi-final against Villarreal after a hard-fought victory at Anfield. The Space Coast Eagles coach Adam Simpson accepts that his side's effort has not been good enough in recent weeks as the club stares down the barrel of its worst start to a season since 2008. The Eagles will, though, welcome back star defender Jeremy McGovern for Friday's clash with Richmond and will also unveil another debutant as they look for just their second win.
Debutant number 12, Greg Clark, will play his first game for the Eagles. The mature age recruit into the side, replacing the concussed Elliot Yeo.
Showed a lot of resilience as a person, as a player, to go through the draft process and not get picked up. Obviously played at Subiaco, become a leader.
West Coast has made 3 changes, with injury ruling out Bailey Williams, while Zach Langdon has been dropped. Jeremy McGovern returns to a defence which has been under siege. The Eagles conceding an average of 63 inside 50s in the last 3 weeks.
You know, we're going to get challenged throughout the year. We know that. We know we're in transition with what we're doing, but effort and work rate needs to be there all the time. So there's no excuses for dropping off like we have in the last 2 weeks.
While the Eagles' struggles have been well documented, Richmond isn't taking them lightly. Damien Hardwick's side is yet to beat the 2018 premiers at Perth Stadium.
They'll be disappointed in their performance last week versus Port, but other than that, I think they've been very, very good for large stints of games. So they're going to be tough. They'll bounce back after last week. It's not reflective of who they are.
The Tigers trained on Perth Stadium this afternoon, with WA defender Sydney Stack to play his first game of the season. Fremantle has made 2 changes for its trip to Geelong. Lloyd Meek in for the concussed Sean Darcy and Josh Tracy replacing the injured Matt Taberner. Meanwhile, the AFL has revealed the fixtures for rounds 12 to 15, with West Coast being handed another Friday night clash, hosting Essendon in round 15. Fremantle hasn't been given a prime-time slot, but will return to Saturday afternoon when it hosts Hawthorn in round 13. Tom Wildey, ABC News.
Let's get a check of the weather. Here's Paul Higgins.
Well, tomorrow and Saturday, the nation's southeast will have some rain. It'll come from a tropical low feeding a northwest cloud band to bring moisture from the Indian Ocean right across the continent, around that pressure trough and ahead of a cold front. Not much in the way of rain elsewhere tomorrow. It'll be dry over central Queensland. Just a chance of showers elsewhere, but especially on the north tropical coast. Brisbane will have a shower or 2 in the morning. A few showers and storms over western and southern New South Wales and a few showers in the northeast. Areas of morning fog which you will see in Sydney, and then a partly cloudy day, fog, then showers at night for Canberra. A sunny morning for Victoria, then showers and storms will spread from the west late in the morning into the afternoon. In Melbourne, 8 to 25 millimetres of late rain. Showers and thunderstorms over western Tasmania in the morning. They will spread statewide, mostly sunny in Hobart before afternoon showers. In South Australia, showers and thunderstorms developing in the south and west during the morning, spreading to most of the state, but especially out here in the east. In Adelaide, a few showers from late morning. Much of Western Australia, including Perth, will be dry. There will be some showers over southern coastal districts, also in the interior and eastern parts of the Pilbara. In the Territory, a chance of showers and thunderstorms across the top end, including Darwin, the eastern Carpentaria and eastern Barkly districts, and in the far south.
Tonight's top stories. Vladimir Putin has warned of lightning-fast retaliation if any country directly interferes in Ukraine, a threat widely seen as a reference to ballistic and nuclear missiles. A former US Marine released from a Russian jail as part of a surprise prisoner swap deal has arrived back home. And firefighters in India's capital struggle to put out a blaze at a landfill that has been burning for 3 days. That is the shape of your world this Thursday. You can catch the show on iView, and there are more world news and interviews at the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Bev O'Connor. Thanks for your company. Bye-bye.
Empathy training, and have you ever had it?
No, I haven't, Lee.
Can you please stand back a bit? Thank you.
Wasn't it a serious conflict of interest getting involved in any way in that grand process?
It's not just about whether it's within the rules, it's about the way it looks.
Lifting wages will have an impact.
Yeah, but how do you lift wages?
There are 9 ministers for housing in this country. What are they all doing? 1,000 jobs.
Address the question.
Now is the time to speak.
7:30, Monday to Thursday, ABC TV and ABC iView.
This election, it's easy to get lost amongst the polls, policies and pledges. Now there's an easy way to find out how your views compare to the major parties. Go online to Vote Compass, answer a few quick questions. You may be surprised where you stand on the political spectrum. Go to abc.net.au/Australia Votes.
Tomorrow on News Breakfast, not one but 2 Friday musical treats. We're joined by beloved singer-songwriter Norah Jones.
And from Las Vegas to the studios of News Breakfast, the boys from Human Nature drop by for a chat and maybe even a special live performance. Don't miss it.
Mysterious, suspenseful, thrilling. New drama on ABC iView.
Who are you?
I'm a bad person who's trying to be good.
What you did dishonours all cops.
When a man is prey to his emotions, he is not his own master.
There's been a report of inappropriate behaviour.
This life, this is all we need. You don't need to prove yourself to anyone.
To stream the best drama for free, log in to ABC iView.
Liam, this is Andy, and he's the father of our child.
Welcome, the love of my life, but also now very old.
We've been neighbours for years.
And yet I barely know you.
Sometimes life just happens.
I'm having a baby!
It arrives.
We can't go on like this.
I know. And you just have to deal with it.
Go find yourself. I feel like a therapist. You make a terrible therapist.
There's a whole part of me you've never seen.
Life, Sunday, ABC TV and ABC iView.
This is a big business. The medical side of it doesn't seem to be a concern. Just making money. That's all they're in for.
Profiting from the pandemic.
It worries me when for-profits have discovered humanitarian disasters as like a gold strike.
Why would Aston Medical pay you that kind of money?
The company cashing in on COVID.
They knew it was risky, but yet they went ahead with it.
Four Corners, Monday, ABC TV and ABC iView. Their mates living the dream.
You and Snap were headed for a fall a long time ago.
But friendship has a breaking point.
Go on, mate. Show them who you really are.
Barons log into ABC iView to stream the series.
When we were teenage girls, we loved dancing, didn't we?
We did, yes. It was lovely. Put your pretty dresses on and away we'd go.
Mm-hmm.
This is the last train coming home too, many times. We didn't get up to too much trouble, did we?
No. It's good to be together.
It is. Okay, here we go. I hope we're off.
What advice would we give to our younger selves?
I think just be polite, help each other, be friendly.
And enjoy it.
Lovely, Beth.
I'm Betty and I'm 92.
I'm Pat and I'm 90. We're happy to be
90 years young.
We are.
Make it 100.
This is an historic day.
Prime Minister told Parliament that
Hello, Manny Tsigas with the top stories on ABC News. The cost of living remains front and centre on the election campaign, with Labor accusing the government of not doing enough to address the issue. The Prime Minister insists the coalition is best placed to manage the economy, despite inflation reaching a 20-year high and an expected interest rate hike. The federal opposition leader will be back on the campaign trail in person tomorrow, after a week in COVID isolation. A high-ranking police officer says the community has had a gutful of gangland murders after an underworld figure was assassinated in a hail of bullets in Sydney's southwest last night. Mahmood Brownie Ahmed was embedded in Sydney's underworld and had $1 million bounty on his head. Police are hunting for his killer, but say Mr. Ahmed had amassed a long list of enemies. And Russia's president has threatened a lightning-fast response, interpreted as the use of ballistic and nuclear missiles, to any outside country that interferes in its Ukraine war. Meanwhile, European Union leaders have accused Russia of blackmail after cutting gas supplies to Bulgaria and Poland. The UN Secretary-General is in Ukraine to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky. And those are the latest stories. I'm Manny Tsigas. Bye for now.
Hello, welcome to The Drum. I'm Julia Baird. Coming up, election campaigning focuses in on the cost of living, with new data showing rents are increasingly unaffordable for low-income earners. Integrity in politics ranks high among voters, but would any of the proposal for a federal anti-corruption body actually clean up politics? And we look at the efforts to get young people interested in politics through comedy. And joining me on the panel tonight, youth advocate Jahin Tanvir joins us for the first time. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Also a student of optometry. Yes. Many hats tonight. Deputy Lord Mayor of the City of Sydney, Jess Scully, is back again. Hello.
Good to be here.
And federal political reporter at the Daily Telegraph, currently flat off her feet, running off her feet. I'm mixing up my metaphors there. Anyway, she's really busy because it's an election on. Claire Armstrong. Thanks for joining us, Claire.
Thanks for having me.
And now, in another temperature, another climb, and another hemisphere, Udine in northern Italy. We have Professor at the School of Education at UNSW, former New South Wales Education Minister, and New South Wales Nationals Party member, Adrian Piccoli. Do we say ciao?
Ciao. Buongiorno.
We're all jealous now immediately, you realise this. And if you want to join us in on Twitter, you just have to use the hashtag The Drum, like always, and we are also on Facebook. Now, we've been hearing a lot about cost of living pressures lately, and for many, the most burdensome cost is rent. Now, today, an annual snapshot of the private rental market has revealed just how heavy that burden is for low-income earners. For a single person on minimum wage, just 1.6% of private rental properties are affordable. For couples on the minimum wage, that goes up to 3.7%. The rentals were deemed affordable if they cost no more than 30% of total household income. But if you think that's bad, the picture for those on welfare is worse.
What we found out of those 46,000 properties is that if you were a single person on JobSeeker, you would have had 7 individual properties, and they were all rooms in share houses that would have been affordable. For someone on youth allowance, nothing. For a disability support pensioner, again, very little, less than 1%. And even for that most generous of government benefits, the age pension, for a couple who were looking for somewhere to rent, 1.4% would have been affordable.
This comes as if inflation hit a 20-year high yesterday, with the government under pressure to explain how it will help Australians make ends meet.
Cost of living pressures are very real, and we understand that. And those pressures, as we know, is emanating from the war in Europe, the hangover from the continuing pandemic, which is disrupting supply chains, putting prices up. They are real pressures. I mean, over this pandemic, we saw after 27, 28 years, the first time Australia went into recession because of that pandemic. These are not ordinary times. They're the hardest economic times we've seen since the Great Depression.
But the opposition says the government has failed to properly address the soaring cost of living.
If the Prime Minister wants to take credit for things that go well in the economy, he needs to take responsibility for the fact that Australians are getting absolutely slaughtered by this triple whammy. And he's been in office now for almost a decade. He only wants to talk about Labor. He only wants to talk about international developments. This is a cost of living crisis, a full-blown cost of living crisis. And Australians are getting absolutely hammered by it, and their Prime Minister, true to form, is nowhere to be seen.
Now, Claire, we're talking about the cost of living almost daily at the moment, and yet neither of the major parties seem to have comprehensive policies to deal with the question of rental affordability. Is this a blind spot?
It's a blind spot in the sense that they're not looking for it. I don't think that it's an accidental one. I just don't think that it's an area of policy that either side particularly wants to focus on, in part because it's really hard to fix. And so if you're going to come to the table and try and propose a way to address it, that proposal has to be sound, and if it was an easy fix, it would have been done. But also I think because there just hasn't been the focus from either side on housing in general as a policy. Both sides have sort of tinkered around the edges with it, trying to increase access to first home buyers grants, and with some effort made on Labor's side, particularly toward affordable housing, a new housing construction. But the problem is structurally in our system. There is just not the supply of housing that then would make something like renting, put downward pressure on prices. More broadly, it's a numbers game. There are more people who own homes. There are millions of Australians. I think it's like 11 million homes owned in Australia. That's a lot of voters. There are a lot of people who are looking to get into the market and a lot of people who are renting, but they are just not as represented broadly across the community as homeowners are. And the unfortunate reality for renters like myself is if a house is cheaper to rent or cheaper to buy, that's bad for the millions of people who own a house usually. So they're not really going to be interested in those kinds of policies.
All right, let's talk to Ashley Stevenson now. She's a former worker in the horticultural industry, and at the age of 66, she's now on JobSeeker and living with a friend. Ashley, welcome back to The Drum. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Julia. Good to see you too.
How's it going, looking for somewhere to live?
It's not going anywhere. Because I've been homeless, I don't get the rental assistance, so my provable income is actually lower than a person who's on JobSeeker and already renting. So when I put my details into the Domain app to look for housing, it only comes up with car parking spaces.
That's all in the area, in the amount that you can afford?
That's correct.
And how broad an area are you looking in?
Greater Sydney. Centrelink won't allow me to leave an area of high employment opportunity to go to an area of lower opportunity, which means everywhere outside Greater Sydney.
And how long is the wait for public housing?
I've been on the list for 7 years, and in that time, the waiting time has doubled. Because the priority listing for my chosen zone is increasing, myself on the general list, I'm actually going backwards.
And is there any opportunity to apply for private housing?
Well, I can apply, but if it's more than 30% of my income, real estate agents will not even consider my application. I've been privately told by a few property managers they will not rent to people on job seeker because they know one day it's going to come down to a choice between rent and food, or rent and your children's food, or rent and medication. And you know, when you're faced with, you know, a medical emergency or something like that, rent always comes second.
And that probably makes it harder to get work as well if you don't have a stable place, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. In what way?
Well, just filling in some forms, I don't have a home. So how do I fill in a form that won't let you progress if you're of no fixed address?
Actually, I'm just going to bring in the rest of the panel now who've been shaking their heads and nodding their heads all throughout this discussion. Some really strong opinions on all of this, I know. Tell us about your experience, Jahin. You're a renter, you're studying in Canberra. What's the market like if you're a student?
Yeah, it's incredibly disheartening to hear, to say the least. So I grew up in Sydney, moved to Canberra for university, so university purposes, and every time that I pay rent on a fortnightly basis, I feel a great sense of privilege because whenever I speak to my fellow friends and colleagues at university, especially between 18 to 27, they are struggling. There's a great deal of struggle. There's a lot of people that you hear stories around that they're having to sacrifice food, they're having to sacrifice, you know, basic fundamentals such as medication because they don't know where the rent money is going to come from. And when you hear the Prime Minister, for instance, talking to young people and saying the best way forward is to encourage to buy a home, that's a little jarring for individuals who, on a moment-by-moment basis, are trying to figure out where are they going to find shelter? Where are they going to find dinner for that day? So it's very disheartening, and I think we need more facilities, more of a systematic change rather than just awareness in general, because people are suffering on a day-to-day basis.
And are people tending to take smaller rooms, to be sharing rooms? Like what other kind? You've spoken about sacrificing some really basic needs. So that what other options do people have in that kind of market?
Yeah, the options are very limited.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of drastic changes in terms of young people living in rooms of 5 to 6. But with, you know, COVID and the pandemic, we're still in a pandemic. Don't forget. So the health, safety, and regulations, that's not correct. You know, and so people have to sort of make do in order to survive. So it's no longer a luxury, it's more about survival than anything. And where's the next paycheck going to come from? Am I going to have a shelter? This is causing mental health distresses. This is causing a lot of challenges in terms of just survival and living. And for a young person who's got other social determinants to think about, this is very demoralising.
Especially when you're trying to study.
Absolutely.
So much of your time is taken up.
The pressure there is enough.
Right. Jess, we talk a lot about supply. It's also about, as a solution, but it's also about the kind of supply, right?
That's absolutely it. I think a greater supply of more unaffordable housing is not going to help. And the market pressures that we have and the perverse incentives we have and the ever-escalating increase in land value means that any new housing that comes on the market almost immediately becomes unaffordable. So I think we need to address that fundamentally the housing model is broken in Australia, and it's broken because we're actually not choosing from a full set of options. So in Australia we basically have like vanilla, strawberry and chocolate in terms of the kind of housing we have. We have social housing, we have market rental, and we have market residential ownership. But actually in the rest of the world there are so many more models to choose from, and there's this idea called the housing continuum, which is basically all the different kinds of subsidised or supported housing that exists in the world, not just in social democratic or social welfare states, but in quite capitalist cities like Singapore, in places like Japan, where it's quite common to have subsidised rental housing for medium income earners, as well as people who might be on welfare or need other supports. So I think we need to go back to basics and say, how do we colour in and expand the housing continuum in Australia? Because currently between 1% and 4% of our housing is social, but we need more affordable housing, subsidised housing for people who are on medium incomes as well as people who are on low incomes, and it can be done.
Adrian, do you think the government needs to be providing assistance for renters, whether it's through pulling more policy levers or intervening more directly in the housing market?
Well, certainly some of the rules and regulations and restrictions around construction, land use, etc., are all considerations for government. Part of what makes housing expensive, whether that's in Sydney or even in rural and regional areas, is the cost of construction. So I'm sure there'd be developers listening to this thinking, well, I'd love to build affordable housing, but by the time I buy the land, meet all the regulatory requirements, which we must have. We've seen the problems recently, Opal Towers, etc., when the regulation hasn't been tough enough. But it's very expensive, and again now with inflation as it is and all the things that happened in the last couple of years, construction costs are going even higher. So land use, construction costs are not helping any of this, because, as I say, even in regional areas, it's very hard to find rental accommodation that is affordable. But if you own half an acre in a regional area and you want to develop it, you've got to rebuild the road in front of it. You've got to build all the turning. You've got to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars outside your land before you can even start building the accommodation. So I mean, that does add to the affordability issue. And can I say, now having lived in Europe for a few months, what you really notice about Australia, it's self-evident that we have lots of people who live in mega cities. Most of our people live in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and the other capitals. In Europe, it's got a lot to do with geography. I get that, but it's a much more dispersed population across the geography, and that helps to make it affordable.
Yeah, but we have seen a lot of that during COVID. People moving out to the regions or up and down to coastal towns, and that's driving the prices up even more and impacting the rental markets even more in those areas.
Yeah. And we've seen some of that. I mean, I don't think it's enough to have shifted kind of Australian culture over the decades to want to live near the beach or within 20 kilometres of the Opera House. But it's just something that's occurred in Australia.
Exactly, yeah.
Again, it's different in the United States. So all of our major, or most of our major employers are in the big cities, and that drives demand. Sorry, I can't remember the lady's name who you interviewed
Ashley,
before.
yes, she's still with us.
I mean, I think it's ridiculous that that Centrelink won't let you leave and go to a regional area where there is employment demand and where housing is more affordable. Not affordable, more affordable.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't believe that kind of restriction is in place. It sounds ridiculous.
Yeah, I just want to bring Jess in. You've been dying to jump in.
Well, people have to, as well as those restrictions, which are difficult, but people have to stay where there is work, where they have networks, where there's care available. I mean, one of the other factors is that if you move outside of some of the inner city areas or major cities, access to childcare is a huge issue. When you look at rental vacancy and affordability in places like the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, for example, that's a place where they're at all-time lows of rental access, and that's only been exacerbated by the current crisis. So, look, I think there are some factors like construction costs that are genuine and are immediate, but this is a slow motion car crash. Over the last 40 years, the price of housing has gone up 3 times faster than wages have gone up. So governments of all stripes have seen this coming for a long time.
Yep.
And in the post-war period, Australia, states and the federal government worked together to invest in public housing, and that has fallen away. And so we actually need that kind of cooperation at a federal level to interrupt the flow of a housing market that's going wrong.
Yeah, and Ashley, as people continue to talk about it and talk about the question of housing affordability and prices are going up, you've been trying to find work and trying to find a place to live. I mean, you're a horticulturalist, and that was your training. Can I read to you, can I put to you something that former Prime Minister John Howard said today, Ashley?
Certainly.
He said, he was speaking to reporters in Brisbane, and he said, I don't accept there is a housing crisis. The cost of housing in this country is much higher than we would like, but a lot of the reasons for housing being expensive in Australia have been baked into the system over the years. And may I say, because of planning and other decisions made by state and local governments to push up the cost of housing. There are cost of living pressures now, there always are cost of living pressures. When you hear that, how do you react?
Well, I think that's possibly true, but I don't think it's the whole story. I think there's other issues here, and the other gentleman mentioning that, you know, it's a function of geography in this country. I really don't have the answers. I do know that if government bodies were working together with people that have brilliant ideas, whether they work within government or not, would go a long way towards helping people like myself get into housing, once stable in housing, and I want to work till I drop. I don't know that anyone wants to hire me at my age, but I'm still quite capable, and I want to contribute. And I hate it when I hear certain people say, you know, that I'm a bludger, that I don't want to work. It hurts.
Yeah, I bet. And when we're talking about it all through this election campaign and people are bandying about various ideas, and as we are on the panel right now, what is it that would help you?
Gee, a miracle. That's the only answer I have. I'm very good at researching and discovering data, and I'm out of ideas.
Yeah. All right, Ashley, we so appreciate you coming back on to talk to our viewers again, and we wish you every good wish your way for things in your future.
Thank you, Julia, and I'm speaking for so many others who don't have the ability to speak as I do. Thank you.
Yeah, and we appreciate you doing so. Thank you, Ashley. All right, in between all the election chaos, many first-time voters are getting ready to cast their first ballots in a few weeks' time. To avoid throwing young people in the deep end of the political pool, the Australian Children's Television Foundation, in partnership with the Australian Museum for Democracy, has launched an educational resource kit on politics designed for primary and secondary school curriculums. Now, the resources are based around a live-action series called The PM's Daughter, telling the story of a teenager moving to Canberra after her mother is elected Prime Minister of Australia.
My mum just moved me and my auntie from Perth to Canberra. We left my friends, my school, my home. This is where I live now. Oh, my mum, she's the new
Prime Minister.
Yep, no big deal, right? I can't even turn on the TV without Mum telling me what to do.
She's wrong about everything. Why are you making deals with Australia's biggest polluter? You will understand one day.
A quick quiz. If you were speaking to the Minister for Roads and Transport, that would be...
boring?
16-year-old Ahali Rahman is a Year 12 student who worked on the curriculum as a youth consultant. She spoke with the ABC this morning about how improving political education is the best way to get more people, young people, more engaged in politics.
After being excluded from politics all our lives and being told that, you know, we're a little too naive or too immature or just not old enough to care about politics. We can't be handed a ballot paper at 18 and be expected to know what to do and vote perfectly and understand our own values and be able to connect that with the policies that are being explored in each election. So I think that we really need to connect with politics and politicians need to connect with us to show us that our voices are important.
Jahin, so many times campaigns like these are run by older people who think we know what the cool kids want and we'll just put up the graphics and we'll kind of make it sexy in some way. Do you think campaigns like this will work?
Absolutely. And first of all, can I just say thank you, Ahali, for raising your voice and being so brave and being such a positive advocate for young people. You know, we've had over 700,000 people enrol in the last day before the enrolment's closed, and most of them were between 18 to 25. And that's very exciting, right?
Yeah.
And I was looking at the coverage and the reporting around that, and most of the coverage were people being astounded. They're like, young people, politics, what? But the reality is it only takes you to speak to a young person like Ahali and groups of young people to realise that young people want to be part of the political process.
Yeah.
They want to be engaged. They want to be competent economic participants in policy shaping, the laws, in how this country is run. And, you know, in my role as a youth advocate, especially in my role with UNICEF Australia as a young ambassador, we've consulted with young people all around the country. So remote, rural, regional, cold communities, Indigenous Australians. And the main thing that's come up from that is we want representation. We want to have a voice that's not there to tick a box or for tokenistic purposes.
Do you have that now?
No, and that's why we're calling for a National Youth Advisory Council. A council that's a peak body for young people from diverse backgrounds, not just young people from, you know, just tokenistic nature, but young people from diverse backgrounds all around Australia to say, hey, we've got a link between the federal government and a body of young people so that the Prime Minister, ministers, MPs can ask them, hey, what do you want as a young person? What's important to you? And we know what's important to young people, right? We know climate change, we know mental health, it's been drawn out. We know what's there. But how do we bring the change? We ask them, as we mentioned with Aheli, what change would you want? What change can be plausible and relevant for your life? So having something like that is very important because young people have a lot to say, but we just need to be elevated and have that voice to, make change and take actions.
So in a way, you're suggesting a structure outside of the major parties as well, which have not had a lot of young people joining them in the past couple of decades.
Yes, well, if they have joined, it's been a bit of a tokenistic role where it's been like, okay, we've got a young person, look at us, we're very progressive. But that doesn't create any change. That just creates the same backdated nature where the same people are in power, the same decisions are being made, and the diversity of thought, especially with young people, aren't being taken into consideration.
What do you think about this, Adrian? Because what Jehan's talking about here is there's just so much energy and will and interest over here, and then kind of the political system over here. How do you better connect that? Why aren't the major parties doing more on that front?
I think the major parties would give anything to have more people participating in the centre. So what's tended to happen over the last couple of decades is that people who are participating, and I mean members of political parties and active members of political parties, have tended to be more either left or right, with particular views, and it's in many ways kept kind of mainstream people out of a lot of mainstream people out of political parties. They all used to have a lot more members than they do now. In the same way that people have left other essentially volunteer organisations. It's hard to get volunteers, and that's what you are as a member of a political party. So yes, there's a lot of involvement and engagement in commentary, kind of activism, which is absolutely essential. There's, this curriculum about what democracy means and what it means in Australia, even the practicalities of what it means to go and vote and number the boxes or whatever you've got to do, I think are absolutely essential. But the biggest step is actually participation. Now, whether it's in the major parties as they exist in Australia or in new parties or in minor parties, whatever they are, that's the hard bit. And democracy is an ugly process. It's not this sort of elegant thing where everybody gets in and they all agree with each other. It's an ugly process. And the closer you get to the
sausage-making machine, the less pretty it is.
The sausage-making machine, the uglier it gets. But that's, it does need people to participate. And I know when I joined as a 21-year-old and I was the same, the local branch was saying, oh, great, isn't it great we've got a 21-year-old in there. And I got involved and I participated. And what I've tried to do throughout my political career is shape the political party that I'm in. Not let the political party shape me, but shape the political party. Now, it's hard to do that as one person, but the more people that participate with similar views, the more likely that is to occur. And that's kind of the shift you need in Australia. And, in some places in Europe, they had political parties here who were the dominant parties ever since the post-Second World War. In France, as an example, those parties virtually don't exist anymore. So this idea that it's got to be a coalition or a Labor government,
what's interesting
not necessarily.
In Europe, the UK, in the US, in Australia, is the data showing a decline in the belief in democracy. And a lot of political science work being done around the erosion of democracy, and especially amongst young people. Claire, interested in your thoughts on this. What sparked your interest in politics?
I'm one of the nerdy high school kids that did all of the political stuff, so I'm probably not quite the mainstream. But I think broadly what maybe sparked my early interest in politics was a curiosity and an interest in the world and the rules that governed everything that happened around me. And as much as we hear mainstream political parties bemoan the struggle in getting young people to engage in their party structures, become members, be a part of the political process, I think throughout history, young people have shown to be pretty good disruptors of whatever the system is. You know, you look through decades of social change where young people really galvanised debate, and it wasn't necessarily by becoming a member of a political party or running for office. It was from protesting or from engaging and lobbying and representing their views outside the system, because the reality is the system isn't really built for them and it doesn't really represent them. And I would love to see that change. And I think that a lot of lip service is paid to that issue by political entities across the spectrum about wanting to engage with young people, and some make the effort to do so meaningfully. But at its core, the political system in Australia and in a lot of Western democracies is not built for an 18-year-old who has a certain set of values that maybe aren't going to be reflected in the broader electorate, which means they're just not as much of value to politicians. And I think that's really, really sad. I actually think that there's a lot more that could be done to give Australian young people a voice. I remember when I was in Year 10, the AEC came and signed us all up to be enrolled, and that was about the extent of the political engagement we got.
It worked for you. What about you, Jess? Sorry, Claire.
Well,
you know, I just think if you look at the political debate we've been having this election, young people don't see any of the issues that they care about represented in that debate. Young people haven't abandoned politics. Politics has abandoned young people. I mean, where's climate action in this debate? Where's affordability in this debate? The issues that matter to young people are not being discussed, and things that they just inherently take as being normal and natural and progress, like being inclusive about gender identity, has become a political football. It's absolutely disgusting to watch. I mean, look at the rise of young people coming out in tens of thousands in the climate marches and being maligned by politicians and saying they should be back in school. Look at Anjali Sharma and those young people taking government to court to say, you have a duty of care to future generations. Why should that have to be argued in court? That should be the basis of politics. That's the basis of the social contract. The big parties and politics needs to be putting young people front and centre, and they actually give politics a genuine timeline. They should be making decisions about the future, about those future generations that don't get to vote today. I think young people they are almost a shame. They are a source of shame for political parties because they are not being taken into account in the political process at all.
All right, you're watching The Drum. With me on the panel, youth advocate Shaheen Tanvir, Deputy Lord Mayor of the City of Sydney Jess Scully, federal political reporter at the Daily Telegraph Claire Armstrong, and in Udine in Northern Italy, Professor at the School of Education at UNSW, former New South Wales Education Minister, New South Wales Nationals Party member Adrian Piccoli. Now, why do we get so upset when elected politicians behave badly or corruptly? I mean, it's obvious at a basic level. It's because they have the power to influence our day-to-day lives, and we like to think we can trust them to make good and fair decisions on our behalf. Now, over 3 years ago, in an effort to, as they say, keep the bastards honest, the Prime Minister announced plans to create a National Integrity Commission. We still don't have a federal ICAC, but the feedback from the election campaign so far has made it abundantly clear the electorate wants one. The Drum's David Taylor looks at what's on offer.
Our elected representatives have power, so it's important we trust them to make reasonable decisions. Anti-corruption commissions are well established across the states and territories. The purpose of a federal integrity commission would be to help maintain trust in federal politicians. The Morrison government made inroads into building a commission, but the plans were never introduced to Parliament, criticised as having serious deficiencies.
The Australian people know that the former Premier of New South Wales was done over, Mr Speaker, by a bad process. I'm not going to have a kangaroo court taken into this Parliament, the Prime Minister
is... But it's clear at least some politicians regret the misstep.
I would love to be standing here today with an Integrity Commission delivered.
The 2022 federal election effectively creates a clean slate to give it another shot. So what are the major parties proposing? Well, the Coalition says its plan for a commission is ready to go. The commission will have an annual budget of $42 million and powers including the ability to compel witnesses, tap phones and execute search warrants. Crucially though, it won't hold public hearings, and there are questions about its definition of corruption.
But the fact that it wouldn't enable investigation of grey area corruption involving pork barrelling or political donations, the fact that whistleblowers would not be able to go directly to the Commission or any members of the public for that matter, the fact that it wouldn't have full transparency in terms of the ability to make public reports or to hold public hearings where that's justified in relation to politicians and 80% of the public service, these are all pretty fundamental failings.
Labor wants the Commission to be empowered to make findings of fact, including a finding of corrupt conduct, but not to make determinations of criminal liability. Instead, findings would be referred to the Federal Police. Labor also wants the Commission to have the power to hold public hearings, where the Commission determines it is in the public interest to do so.
There's no doubt a strong anti-corruption commission should be able to not just refer matters to the AFP, but directly to the Director of Public Prosecutions, or if necessary, to actually lay criminal charges itself to make sure that corruption matters get put before the courts.
Independent MP Helen Haines has received some support for her bill. She proposes to create a commission that has appropriate and proportionate powers to investigate, where necessary, serious and/or systemic corruption issues involving or affecting the Commonwealth Government. Surveys show 85% of voters believe corruption is somewhat or very much a problem in the country. And when the ABC asked you said you believe politicians who lie, pork barrel or wrongly claim taxpayer money should quit. Only 1% of us think corruption is not a problem at all.
So, Adrian, I think we can take from that 85% thinking corruption's a problem in the country. There seems to be a strong will to do something about it. Is this model that's been put up by the coalition that's being criticised for being toothless, is that a sufficient one? Will that actually address the problems that we have?
Well, I don't know about the model in its finest detail, but to me, the issue with a federal, well, with ICAC in New South Wales and then a federal equivalent, is this notion of, there should be a federal corruption commission, let's put it that way. My issue is around how they conduct it. And I've never been a fan, I've said this on the drum before, of the public hearings. I do think they're a kangaroo court in many ways. They're a sort of show trial for media. The definition of corruption is too broad. All of those things that professor talked about in there, about misusing funds and allowances and taking donations, etc., can all be prosecuted through courts, but it's not named corruption. Can even be criminal behaviour, but it's not named as corruption. So,
but can all of those behaviours be prosecuted? Sorry to interrupt, but can all of those behaviours be prosecuted through courts?
Those,
like, what about pork barrelling? What about the use of funds for that might work in your own party's interests? I mean, isn't that the problem? That whether the standard of criminal conduct actually encompasses unethical and corrupt behaviour?
So if pork barrelling is that you as a politician, or let's say certainly as a minister, you make allocations of funds contrary to the law, then well, I'm presuming it's a criminal offence to do that. Well, then it's a criminal offence, right? So
okay,
that's a problem.
Adrian, is there pork barrelling that occurs in this country without it going to court?
I mean, when Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor, etc., did the deal with the Labor, with Julia Gillard to form a minority government, did they not elicit promises from the government to do things in their own electorates? I mean, is that pork barrelling? I mean, would Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor have been taken to this corruption commission and said, you're guilty of actually leveraging the government for pork barrelling?
Well,
would Gillard have been brought before? I mean,
Jahid wants to jump in at this point. No, they're not. It's just
money has to be allocated in the right way, based on need and a proper analysis, etc. Absolutely, you're absolutely right. But what you're saying is, in that case, Tony Windsor Rob Oakeshott and Julia Gillard would have been taken to a corruption commission, public hearings about how they allocated, let's say, projects in their own electorates, because that's exactly what happened.
I think the question is there behaviour, political behaviour that's occurring that would fall under the umbrella of unethical, corrupt, acting in your own interest, that currently there's no place where you can question it or call to account. But can I just bring Jahin in now, because you've been wanting to speak?
Yes, I've just been itching to say a few things. So I'm actually a little surprised that we don't have something at the federal level in terms of an anti-corruption commission. You know, before being a youth advocate, I'm a young person, I'm a 21-year-old. And with any company or organisation, you always have some sort of regulatory governance in ensuring that there's integrity, there's respectability, that everything's in accordance to something. And so you'd expect at a federal level, it's bare minimum. It's not something we should be having a conversation with. And clearly the general public, 85%, think the same. And it's quite disheartening, to say the least, because we've had very new voters, first-time voters coming in this election. So it's no secret that trust equates with transparency. So if you have more transparency, they'll want to trust you more. So let's not look at it through a negative lens. Let's look at the positives that come out of it.
Could I just add something to that? I think trust equates to transparency, but also accountability. Yeah. And that's the thing that's sort of been lacking in politics over the last few years. The idea that if you do something wrong, that you are responsible for it. And that hasn't happened.
Claire, your view on this, I mean, what we're arguing about now is a model. And what would best address the problems, both perceived and actual, in a political system. And one model was Helen Haynes, seemed to have some bipartisan agreement. Can you talk us through what happened with that?
Well, I suppose, yes, we are pretty much just in a position now where everyone's broadly across the fact that an integrity commission needs to happen. What does the model look like? I think that the answer to that will be decided when the election is decided. The makeup of the parliament will dictate that. The Helen Haynes model obviously addresses some of the concerns that were had with the coalitions around public hearings, about being more broad in the definition of corruption to capture some of the things that we've been talking about here, the examples of things that are not necessarily outside the scope of the law in terms of a criminal sense, but are arguably raise issues of integrity. And I think what we will probably see is that if Labor win government, they've obviously got their own proposal that they're working through, and that has a lot of similarities to what the independent bill looked like. And obviously the coalition are staying very firm with their proposal being the only one that they're willing to put on the table, and it's a take it or leave it situation. Though I think that may possibly change, of course, if they end up having to negotiate in minority government with people like Helen Haynes, who very clearly have different views of what the model should look like. Ultimately, broadly, what this debate is about is striking a balance between actually addressing the concerns that are raised, instilling trust, restoring trust in our political system, in our politicians, without running ahead of evidence and transparent and being transparent without just airing every scandal, every grievance in a very publicly viewed way. And I think that balance is really tricky. I'm a journalist. I think that hearings should be public. But just like in any court case, I understand that there are elements, certain witnesses or certain pieces of evidence that can't necessarily be public or can't necessarily be public at that time. And I think there is actually scope to have a balance of public hearings, elements that are not heard publicly until a finding is made but are then made public, just as we have in the current court system. If we can deal with incredibly complex criminal behaviour in our court system and find a balance between transparency, accountability, and also protecting people who may not, innocent until proven guilty, then surely we can find that balance in a situation where hopefully most of the time we're talking about things like misuse of funds rather than extreme criminal behaviour that our courts deal with, like murder. So if we can deal with it in one extreme situation, surely we can find that balance in the far, less lives at stake situation of transparency in the way that our public funds are used.
Yeah, Adrian, can I ask you to comment on that? You've been speaking about a kangaroo court and wanting to avoid that. The Prime Minister has used that language kind of throughout the campaign when talking about former Premier Gladys Berejiklian, as well as the Integrity Commission. Can you spell out for us, what do you think would have been different in our political system if hearings had been held in private and not public, with public findings?
I don't know that we would have anything, it would be any different. So any corrupt conduct should be investigated, and where it's found to have occurred, absolutely prosecuted. Of course that's the case. We would expect that. But what happens in New South Wales is once there's an allegation, then you go through this public process of a public hearing. Now ICAC have already asked those witnesses all of those questions behind closed doors. And then they say, oh, well, we're now going to be public. And as soon as you're a witness, particularly if you're a politician, like the former Premier, 2 former Premiers in New South Wales, actually 3 former Premiers,
yes.
You are forced to resign, right? Because, there's the allegation of corrupt, there's the stench of corruption, right? So you're forced to resign. But at the end of the day, with 2 of them, and let's see with the 3rd, there were no recommendations for, in the end, the first one got overturned. The second one, with Barry O'Farrell, there were no recommendations for prosecution. And let's see what happens with Premier Gladys Berejiklian.
Everyone's going to jump in. Claire, can you go first? Sorry, just quickly. Yes. Just quickly,
I was on the campaign trail with Anthony Albanese when he was actually asked directly if a frontbench minister of yours ended up being called before your version of a federal ICAC, would you automatically stand them down? And he even made the point that it would depend on a case-by-case basis, and if they were a witness, for example, that wouldn't necessarily automatically mean they should be stood down. So I think that you do that Adrian is right there. There is still to be worked about. Yeah, there's something to be worked out there around how we treat someone being called as a witness before findings have been made.
Jess.
So I think it's great that we're talking about trust in politics and about the idea of integrity in politics, but I think the National Integrity Commission is not just the be-all and end-all that will solve that problem. We need to be having a conversation about political donations and reporting of political donations, and we need to have a conversation about truth in political advertising as well, and I hope this catapults those topics into the conversation. And to go back to Adrian's points, which, I think that idea that a politician can't represent their electorate and advocate for their electorate, I think that isn't what people are talking about here. I think we need to have a conversation about what are the acceptable community standards for how public funds are used, so that it's not whiteboards and spreadsheets, but there's some consistency and clarity so people know that they're even in with a shot when they put in for a grant.
Yeah, look, and Helen Haynes, very quickly, because I just want to get on to our last topic. Adrian, yes.
The best thing that the former Labor government in New South Wales ever did was limit political donations. And if the federal government or opposition want to make a great promise about integrity in government, it's limiting it. I mean, it was great for politicians because you didn't have to go to fundraisers, and I think great for donors too. They didn't have to feel as though they had to contribute to political parties. Best thing they ever did for integrity.
All right. Now, in the midst of an election campaign, our sympathy for politicians at the moment might be pretty low. So while trying to avoid a tiny violin, let me tell you that new research has shown that as a job, politics is particularly demanding, with long hours, heavy workloads and physical isolation all part of the job. Researchers for Western Sydney Uni spoke to 13 politicians anonymously. Now, these included a former Premier, federal and state MPs and ministers, on what it's actually like as a job. Here's what some of them had to say.
Politics is the most physically, intellectually, emotionally challenging role I could imagine.
The systems that we have favour people who seek power. There are politicians that will only do things that they can claim credit for.
The biggest challenge of leadership is having to make the hard decisions, knowing that there are times when you've got to make some decisions that will have a negative impact on people.
Politics is a blood sport, and so it can get very personal. Families really suffer as a result.
I'm often juggling family time with work time. The guilt of leadership and commitment to the job can take its toll.
We start work at 9 o'clock, we finish at 8:30 at night. We're not allowed to leave the building. We're in our own offices, we meet for a particular purpose, and then we separate again.
It can be quite lonely, and I noticed that particularly when I moved into the role of Premier.
There's the idea that you are constantly available, that people can tweet at you or Facebook message you anytime, day or night.
We don't have the control of our working lives, so it's not work-life balance, it's work-work balance.
I wonder how much the community understands the extent of the demand that it places, not just on the individual, but on their family, their friends, their physical health.
Adrian, how many years was it for you? 16?
19.
19, okay, 3 off. Do you think, yeah, that's a long time, you know. And
so I'm in Italy, rehab.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, you're kind of joking, but probably kind of not as well. I know
joking.
it can, right? Okay, it can take a while to detox from politics, I think. But do you think the general public understand what it's like to be a politician?
Not from a day-to-day perspective, because I think what gets reported, like let's talk even during an election campaign, is a fraction of 1% of what's actually happening out across 150 electorates across Australia, what individual candidates and politicians are actually doing, even what gets reported about what happens in Parliament. I mean, people are always surprised when you tell them that 90% of legislation is passed by unanimous agreement across all MPs.
Right.
So, you know, what we argue about and what you see on television or in their papers is actually a very small part of what goes on. And I don't think people see, you know, they see their local member turn up at an event or in the media and don't get to see what demands there are on that job. But, you know, having said that, I loved my time as a politician. Lots of other jobs have lots of demands. I know people who are lawyers, they work all hours of the night. You know, they do 24-hour stints if there's a big deal on. You know, it's not the only
healthcare workers
job
in a pandemic, it's true. It's true,
Yeah.
but I mean, I think one of the reasons we're talking about this tonight is just that fundamental question of, like, a lot of people leave burnt out. A lot of people talk about how difficult the scrutiny was, how difficult it is to operate in that kind of environment, and whether in fact that provides a disincentive for good people to go into Parliament. Jess, what's it like as a local councillor?
Well, I think what we should also talk about is who's not there.
Right.
And there are real structural inhibitors to diversity in politics. You know, it's called representative democracy, but it's not that representative when you look at who's sitting there. You know, culturally, it's not that diverse. You've got many more men than women. You've got much older people than the population. And that's because structurally it's not designed for people with caring responsibilities. It's not designed for people who come from diverse backgrounds or lower incomes. And at a local government level, it's actually a bit worse. You know, the average age.
Tell us why it's not. Sorry to interrupt.
Well,
but
yeah.
Why is it not?
Well, it's a choice, you know, and it's not the same all around Australia. So in New South Wales, for example, local government councillors are not paid full-time. Even your mayor, wherever you live, probably isn't paid to work full-time. So we have to maintain working roles outside of our responsibilities to our local community. We are not paid superannuation. So we will start to get superannuation as of July this year. We're not paid mat leave. 4 weeks after I had my daughter, I was back working. We're not paid for annual leave or anything like that. And no one wants to hear a politician or an elected representative complain about that, because it's a privilege and an honour to represent people. But
we also at the same time complain about the calibre and breadth of our politicians all the time.
And that's why you tend to get people who are already privileged, already wealthy, don't have caring responsibilities or are out of that phase of their life. And the quality of our democracy and local representation suffers because of it. You know, I don't expect people to know or care what I have to do. I don't know what the life of a nurse or a chef or, you know, someone working in aged care, the constraints and the challenges that they face as well. But I do know that we're all impacted if we don't have a quality and diversity of representatives speaking for us and coming from a wealth of backgrounds and experiences. And it can be different. In Queensland, for example, councillors are paid full-time. They're supported in their roles. They're often quite well compensated. And you know, it's a choice that state governments make on behalf of local communities.
Claire, you work very closely with politicians. And also understand, and report on the high level of cynicism and distrust and concern, and a feeling that, a lot of people don't have a voice or they aren't being represented. What happens when an entire group of people are viewed with suspicion like that? You know what I mean? About their motives for being there, or what happens to a profession if everyone thinks that they must all be there in there for money? They're all in there for their own interests.
Well, I think it's a missed opportunity on both sides, because people disengage. They don't feel represented, or they don't feel that they can trust the people that are representing them, and so they withdraw. And I think that it's really sad when I speak to members of the public who really are disparaging of politicians generally, or even a politician specifically, because that's a missed opportunity for that person, more than likely with a very legitimate grievance, to have a moment of engagement with the political system that is controlling or influencing that particular grievance. When you have, a society that broadly, and politicians, just like journalists, sadly, usually rank pretty low in the trust and respect professions. So as an aside, I don't know what that makes a political journalist, the combination of the two. Probably not very good. But it's really sad. They're hard jobs, they're demanding jobs, and I don't think anyone for a minute is saying that it's the hardest, the most demanding, that you're not properly compensated at every level. Obviously, in federal parliament, you are compensated quite well for being a politician, but you do pay a high personal price, I think, as a politician. And I wouldn't say I work with politicians, but I definitely work alongside them, and you do get moments of seeing real effects on just the demands on their time. The constant scrutiny, obviously, is a big one as well. It's just impossible to say that being constantly criticised all the time in every aspect of your waking life is not going to have some kind of psychological impact, because of course it is, because everyone is a human. So I think that it's really sad to me that there are these, overall just really missed opportunities to actually have meaningful discussions between people and politicians.
Jahin.
Yes, just to add some final points to what Jess said as well about the quality of life and how we have quite unrealistic expectations of politicians. I didn't know that. Growing up, what does it mean to be a politician other than going to Parliament House? We never have these conversations. So I think as young people, we want to have more of this dialogue and actually understand and bridge that gap that may exist in terms of what I do know, what I don't know. But I think hearing from Jess's experiences, it is a good step forward.
In terms of feeling like you can do something.
Yeah, feeling more empowered.
Feeling more empowered. You felt really empowered, sure, Adrian. You must feel very empowered initially, especially after your morning coffee. Unfortunately, we have to end there. I really want to thank our panel for a great discussion tonight. Jahin Tanvir, Jess Scully, Claire Armstrong and Adrian Pickley. You can have Ellen with you tomorrow. I'm off to Italy to just detox generally. Who's coming? We're out. Ciao. Good night.
Comedian Griff Rhys-Jones is taking in an immense, huge and almighty land.
This truly is Canada. Magnificent.
The only way.
Oh! Did you hear that?
He knows how.
Welcome aboard, sir.
Thank you.
What we're using is what nature provides.
Looks like magic to me.
Griff's Canadian Adventure, Saturday at 6 on ABC TV and ABC iView. Building a home causes a range of emotions.
What's mad? Wow.
Some visions are meticulously planned.
Every inch so well crafted.
This is exactly what I hoped it would be.
That is magic. I mean, proper magic.
Others just go with the flow.
Drunken eBay purchase. It's going to be really urban meets rural.
How are you going to do it?
Not sure yet.
All new grand designs. Sunday on ABC TV and ABC iView. Making miniatures calls for surprising ingredients.
Emu feathers,
Tea bags.
rhubarb seeds.
Fish tank stocking.
The tiny team turn their attention to 19th century Adelaide.
This photo is like gold.
And an aerial adventure that caused quite a stir.
There's no safety harness.
Crazy.
Tiny Oz.
It's so quiet. It's
Tuesday 8:30 on ABC TV and streaming on ABC iView.
Have you tried Freeview? Discover all the amazing content across free-to-air TV in one easy place. We've got over 50,000 episodes, more than 30 channels to choose from. 100% free. Visit freeview.com.au. Children aged 5 to 11 years can now receive their free COVID-19 vaccine. It's the best way to protect them, your family, and community. All vaccines are thoroughly tested before use and reduce a child's chances of getting sick. Talk to your GP, pharmacist, or healthcare professional if you have questions. Book now at australia.gov.au. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
Police say Mr. Justice Opaz was shot with a .22 calibre weapon.
The Parramatta blast shattered brickwork in the forecourt of the empty family court building.
Who premeditated and pre-planned the crimes.
This series of crimes is unparalleled in Australian history.
Len turned around and said, I can shoot you anytime I want to.
The Family Court Murders starts Tuesday, May 10 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
It's such a scary thing, feeling like you're not in control of your mind.
Can art and creativity transform mental health?
Look at this! All will be revealed.
Space 22 starts May 17 on ABC TV and ABC iView. To keep streaming on ABC iView, you now need to log in with an ABC account. So log in and save something you want to enjoy later by adding it to your watch list. Pick up where you left off across logged in devices. Plus, check out recommendations to unearth new shows and movies.
So, when does the show start?
Log in with an ABC account and make ABC iView yours.
Out of ISO, the WA Premier back on deck as case numbers rise on the last day of the mask mandate. How the major parties compare on battling a rising cost of living. Pay protection for fruit pickers. Farm workers guaranteed a minimum wage rather than picking or packing produce by piece rate.
Coming up on The Business, rental stress hits home. Sky-high rents and record low vacancies. Why affordable housing is increasingly out of reach.
This is ABC Late News. I'm Pamela Medlin. Just hours before the easing of COVID restrictions in WA, the state has recorded a rise in new cases, adding almost 9,000 to the tally. But the Premier, Mark McGowan, who emerged from his own COVID isolation, says the state is ready.
Glory, glory, Man United!
WA's COVID restrictions, almost a thing of the past.
What a great day. West Australians love their sport and they love to party, and we've got a cracking announcement today.
4 of the English Premier League's biggest teams playing in Perth this July. Selling WA to the world has become an easier task without masks and other measures.
Taking away the G2G pass is another hurdle or restriction which they no longer have to negotiate. So I think it'll be really positive for tourism arrivals into WA.
But heading into the winter cold and flu season, some fear WA is now fielding a weak defence.
We could have given it a bit more time to see what was going to happen, especially over June and July.
Some workplaces will continue to mandate masks. For others, it's a personal choice.
Potentially I could pass it on to somebody else who is more vulnerable than I am, but also I would lose quite a bit of income.
So we made the decision as an organisation that we would continue to wear masks throughout the next month. And there's a few reasons for that. One is we want to see what happens with the numbers.
I'm not nervous because I know we're well prepared, and I know that
people will continue to do the right thing. If people need to wear a mask in certain environments, they will.
On the eve of new freedoms, the Premier is enjoying his own freedom from COVID isolation.
I'm feeling good. Obviously, knocks you around a little bit, but I'm fine now.
Another 8,800 West Australians have tested positive for COVID, and the state recorded 7 deaths. Back in March, health authorities predicted WA would have 129 COVID deaths over 6 months. There's now been more than 140 people with COVID die in just 2 months. But the Health Department doesn't distinguish, and often can't distinguish, whether COVID was the cause of death. James Carmody, ABC News.
This week's shock inflation figure is forcing the major parties to defend their plans to bring down the cost of living. At more than 5%, inflation's at a 20-year high, meaning the Reserve Bank is all but certain to increase the official cash rate as early as next week. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
Who wants to read this book?
Labor says tackling the rising cost of living begins with supervised child play.
Labor's childcare policy will reduce those cost pressures on families.
Okay, we're going to build a little go-kart. You ready?
More affordable childcare, bringing not only a financial benefit,
saving an average family $1,600 a year,
but allowing parents to work more hours, which the Shadow Treasurer says is key to tackling the combination of shrinking real wages, higher inflation and rising interest rates.
Australians are getting absolutely slaughtered by this triple whammy.
Cheaper childcare part of Labor's wage and cost of living plan, along with cutting power bills by investing in cheaper and cleaner energy, fee-free TAFE and university training for higher paid jobs, regulating the gig economy and supporting minimum wage cases, especially in aged care.
There is no magic pen that enables you to write a letter to somebody which all of a sudden sees wages go up.
The Coalition still hailing its budget cost of living package.
Designed to grow our economy, to create more jobs and to put more money into people's pockets.
A 6-month halving of fuel excise, reducing the pump price by 22 cents a litre, a $250 payment to pensioners and concession card holders rolling out this week, and from July 1, a $1,500 tax offset for 10 million low and middle income earners.
They will get effectively a tax hike when the low and middle income tax offset runs out.
But Labor doesn't intend extending the tax offset either, so that effective tax hike is coming whoever wins on May 21.
Liberal and Labor are taking pot shots at each other, but neither of them have got a plan to tackle the cost of living crisis.
But soon, Australians will have to decide who they entrust the economy to for the next 3 years. Scott Morrison continuing to urge voters to stick with the one you know in troubled times.
We're in the middle of a global pandemic with a war in Europe.
The war in Ukraine doesn't explain or excuse a decade of this mob going after people's wages and job security.
Can either side stop the squeeze on households? Of course not. One-off payments are one-off, temporary measures are temporary, and Labor's childcare plan would take many months to bed down. And in that time, interest rates will have risen considerably, with next week's expected rise likely the first of several back-to-back rate hikes. As for wage growth, no one has solved the modern mystery as to why it remains stubbornly low, even in an era of low unemployment. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Vladimir Putin has warned of lightning-fast retaliation if any country directly interferes in Ukraine, in a threat widely seen as a reference to ballistic and nuclear missiles. Ukraine's allies have stepped up support of heavy weapons and equipment, with the first Australian-made armoured vehicles being deployed on the front lines. ABC correspondent Nick Dole reports from the capital, Kyiv.
In central Kyiv, the wives of soldiers trapped hundreds of kilometres away in Mariupol call out to the world for help.
Join the corridor in Mariupol.
The southeast port city is now under Moscow's control. Ukraine's allies have committed to sending more heavy weapons to support the country's fighting forces, including Australian Bushmaster armoured vehicles, which have already been deployed.
Спасибо, прошу.
President Vladimir Putin has issued a stark warning to the West that direct intervention will not be tolerated.
If someone intends to intervene, they should know that our retaliatory strikes will be lightning fast. We have the tools for this, things no one else can boast of having.
Moscow has turned off the gas to Bulgaria and Poland. Ukraine's allies say it amounts to weaponising energy supplies.
Both Poland and Bulgaria are now receiving gas from their EU neighbours. The era of Russian fossil fuel in Europe is coming to an end.
But economic pressure is struggling to put out the flames of Vladimir Putin's war. Towns like Moshun outside Kyiv have already experienced the full force of a Russian attack.
The damage to this village is so widespread that from the ground it almost looks like a bushfire or a cyclone's been through here. But from above you can get a better sense of what's happened. Hundreds of massive shells have rained down on this town, creating huge craters in the ground like this one. The buildings that took a direct hit were obliterated.
Most civilians got out of here, but great-grandmother Lydia Zayka didn't have time. She showed us the cellar where she hid while the shells came down around her. She'd been preserving food in advance.
You ate all this while you were down here?
At least if I died, I'd die with a full stomach, she said. When the guns fell silent, she emerged to find her village empty and in ruins.
After a month I came out of hiding. I saw the houses around me were bombed and burnt. And then I realised I was all alone.
Lydia doesn't want to leave her home. It's been her refuge for the past 2 months. But no one's joining her here anytime soon. Nick Dole, ABC News, Moshun.
A new system of pay for farm work has come into effect. For the first time, fruit pickers will be guaranteed a minimum rate rather than being just paid based on how much they pick.
In this orchard south of Hobart, harvest season looks like business as usual. But it's undergoing one of the industry's biggest ever changes.
We're being told to compensate or reward low productivity, and that's where it's going to really hurt.
These workers are getting paid by how much they pick. From today, they're guaranteed a base wage, regardless of the amount they harvest. Some growers say the added costs will be hard to absorb.
The cost of meeting the requirements for people who aren't productive going forward is going to be too high compared to the cost for what we're getting for our product.
Industry bodies say those costs may mean higher produce prices.
It is likely to be the case. There will be higher cost pressures. Whether that transfers into prices or not is another matter, but there will be a pressure on that for sure.
The new rules are also likely to change the makeup of the workforce.
And unfortunately, it will be a less viable workplace for the traditional casual backpackers, students, semi-retired people who used to come in a few days a week, happy to earn some cash in hand or some money in hand.
That will mean more workers like Hendra and Rio, seasonal workers who treat it like a full-time job.
Someone working hard, someone not working hard, so what's the pay same price? I think that's not fair.
It's good, and also I believe that for the whole team it will be good for my team, Timorese team.
Producers, even those who support the change, say consequences are inevitable as an entire industry overhauls its hiring practices. Unions, at the same time though, they say that minimum pay rates have been a long time coming and farms need to quickly fall into line.
So you can still incentivise workers to be more productive, which is good for the farmer, good for the farm worker. Everyone wins out of that scenario. That is still allowed. What this does do is stop those unscrupulous employers, those dodgy employers.
Weeding out the bad apples while protecting those who harvest the rest. Erin Cooper, ABC News.
Manchester United will return to Western Australia in July as part of 2 exhibition games featuring 4 Premier League clubs at Perth Stadium. The Red Devils will play Aston Villa on Saturday, July 23rd, while Leeds United and Crystal Palace clash the night before. The clubs have committed to bringing full-strength teams, including United's Portuguese star Cristiano Ronaldo.
Ronaldo likes the look of this. Oh, wow!
We'll bring in the best possible squad here. New manager coming in, every player will want to impress.
It's the second time in 3 years United and Leeds have visited Perth as part of their pre-season. West Coast coach Adam Simpson accepts his side's effort hasn't been good enough in recent weeks. The Eagles will welcome back star defender Jeremy McGovern for Friday's clash with Richmond and will also unveil another debutant.
Debutant number 12, Greg Clark, will play his first game for the Eagles. The mature age recruit into the side, replacing the concussed Elliot Yeo.
Showed a lot of resilience as a person, as a player, to go through the draft process and not get picked up. Obviously played at Subiaco, become a leader.
West Coast has made 3 changes, with injury ruling out Bailey Williams, while Zach Langdon has been dropped. Jeremy McGovern returns to a defence which has been under siege. The Eagles conceding an average of 63 inside 50s in the last 3 weeks.
You know, we're going to get challenged throughout the year. We know that. We know we're in transition with what we're doing, but effort and work rate needs to be there all the time. So there's no excuses for dropping off like we have in the last 2 weeks.
While the Eagles' struggles have been well documented, Richmond isn't taking them lightly. Damien Hardwick's side is yet to beat the 2018 premiers at Perth Stadium.
They'd be disappointed in their performance last week versus Port, but other than that, I think they've been very, very good for large stints of games. So they're going to be tough. They'll bounce back after last week. It's not reflective of who they are.
The Tigers trained on Perth Stadium this afternoon, with WA defender Sydney Stack to play his first game of the season. Fremantle has made 2 changes for its trip to Geelong. Lloyd Meek in for the concussed Sean Darcy and Josh Tracy replacing the injured Matt Taberner. Meanwhile, the AFL has revealed the fixtures for rounds 12 to 15, with West Coast being handed another Friday night clash, hosting Essendon in round 15. Fremantle hasn't been given a prime-time slot, but will return to Saturday afternoon when it hosts Hawthorn in round 13. Tom Wildey, ABC News.
Taking a look around the country for Thursday. Cloudy in Melbourne, mostly sunny for Adelaide. Showers over the remainder and a shower or 2 with a possible storm in Darwin. And that's ABC Late News. I'm Pamela Medlin. Thanks for your company. You can stay up to date throughout the night by visiting our website. Stay with us now, though, for the business.
Welcome to The Business. I'm Alicia Barry. Coming up on the program, rental stress hits home, sky-high rents and record low vacancies, why affordable housing is increasingly out of reach.
We've seen a lot of investors leaving the market, and then when the pandemic hit, that selling by investors really was supercharged.
And the climate wars reignite in the coalition amid accusations of a scare campaign on a carbon tax.
I think to call this a carbon tax and therefore by definition something we don't want or can't pay for is a wrong position.
A third of Australians are renters, but finding affordable accommodation is becoming a crisis for many. Rental stress is increasingly the norm, with rents at a 7-year high and vacancies at a record low. For the past few years, investors have been selling their properties to owner-occupiers, while others have turned them into short-stay accommodation. Here's Daniel Ziffer.
Veronica Silva is being turfed out of her home. Her landlord is selling it.
It's just too hard. I'm crying myself to sleep most nights because it's just stress.
She's found somewhere else to rent, but it's 60 kilometres further inland, away from her 13 great-grandchildren.
I'll end up locking myself in that house and not coming out. That's what's going to happen to me.
Her new place costs $70 more a week, so Veronica will have to cut back on food and her internet. Across Australia, rents are rocketing.
We have a national level crisis around housing supply.
Every year we say it's tight. This year it could not be tighter.
Vacancies are at record lows.
We've seen a lot of investors leaving the market, and then when the pandemic hit, that selling by investors really was supercharged.
REA Group estimates around 20% of current properties are sold by landlords, while only 8% are bought by new investors. Despite our growing population, the number of houses and units available to rent has fallen by a quarter over the past decade. During the pandemic, about 500,000 people left Australia and returned home. That should have meant lower rents and plentiful options. But many landlords looked at the white-hot housing market and decided to sell. Others, seeing a future of lockdowns and difficult international travel, picked up holiday homes. It means as migration returns, many rental properties that used to exist simply aren't there anymore.
Well, the reality of leaving it to the free market is that there's no affordable rentals for people who are on low and now even modest income.
Affordable housing is defined as costing 30% of a household's income. The latest snapshot of more than 45,000 listings nationwide exposes how unaffordable rental housing is for people on low incomes. If you're on a minimum wage or receive welfare payments, it's almost impossible to find an affordable place to rent.
This is by far the lowest that we've seen availability and that we've seen affordability. It really is desperate.
The pandemic saw rents fall briefly in Melbourne and Sydney, but they've recovered. In regional and coastal areas, they've soared as tree changes moved out of cities and those already there stayed.
We are moving back into this dangerous scenario where supply for housing will be dropping right at the time that demand will be increasing.
Parties contesting the federal election and state governments are making billion-dollar commitments to build social housing.
Look, the big issue over a long period of time in the housing market is that we haven't seen the investment into low-cost rental accommodation that we need.
The National Rental Affordability Scheme that subsidised Veronica's landlord for a decade was axed in 2014. In her suburb alone, support will disappear for 22 homes this year.
I'm going to miss all these people that are around me. They all have, at one stage or not, touched my life and made it better. And I've got to go and do that again at 78. I can't.
Rising pressure in homes across the nation.
The climate wars reignited in the ranks of the coalition this week, temporarily taking some of the focus off the cost of living battle. LNP Senator Matt Canavan broke party ranks, declaring coalition policy of net zero emissions by 2050 is dead in the water. The skirmish no doubt distracted from the Prime Minister's attack on Labor, branding its climate policy as a sneaky carbon tax. All of this as the country's peak business groups call for much tougher cuts to emissions by 2030. I spoke to the Energy Director of the Grattan Institute, Tony Wood. Tony Wood, welcome to The Business.
Thank you, Alicia.
This is the cost of living election campaign, but the other big issue, of course, is climate change. How helpful do you think it is that we have seen the reignition of the climate wars?
Not very helpful at all. Many people in the electorate would be more than frustrated when we just thought we had peace was breaking out, when both parties agreed last year that we should aim to achieve what the end of the game should be, net zero by 2050. And yet we're now back arguing the detail of what tiny steps we're going to take in 2022 to get there, when we should be arguing how the hell we're going to make what is really an industrial revolution on a timetable.
In the news this week, Labor's policy, which is essentially a co-opted coalition policy, the safeguard mechanism, has been jumped on by the Prime Minister. He's called it a sneaky backdoor carbon tax. Is it?
If you use Richard Marles' number, which was they'd have to pay about $24 a tonne, it could be a lot less, it could be a lot more, that would mean about $1.20 per tonne of coal. And coal right now, whether it's metallurgical coal or thermal coal, is selling for anywhere up to $300 a tonne. So this is a tiny financial impact and would start us moving in a way that even the Business Council has said they support. So I think to call this a carbon tax and therefore by definition something we don't want or can't pay for is a wrong positioning. What we should be talking about is Labor's policy to get us to net zero credible or less credible or more credible than what the coalition government's proposing to get to exactly the same destination?
You mentioned the Business Council there, arguably one of the biggest business lobby groups, which has essentially supported this safeguard mechanism. The other big business lobby groups want deeper cuts to emissions faster. Will either of the parties' policies take us there?
Well, not at the moment. We've got this broad target from both sides, but because both parties are so uncomfortable about completely fleshing out what policy structures they would use to get there, and whether you call it a carbon tax or a carbon price or an emissions trading scheme or all the other labels we've looked at over the last 20 years of the climate wars, it almost doesn't matter all that much. The problem is we've got a game on without rules. And neither party, in my view, has really given us a comprehensive set of rules. Labor has proposed a reasonably clear and relatively modest change in the safeguard mechanism, which applies to industrial emissions. But we've still got issues to do with electricity, as we really do get high levels of renewables. We've still got transport, which isn't being talked about much by either party, which is, again, about 20% of our emissions. And then there's agriculture, which is mostly about burping cows and sheep. So none of that is being discussed as to how we're going to get to net zero by 2050, let alone if we're not going to get to zero by 2050. Net zero means we're going to have to be we're taking emissions out of the atmosphere. And no one's talking about that either, except to say they're questioning whether some of the current mechanisms to do that are even dodgy or not. So we seem to be having the wrong conversation.
One government minister this week called for new coal-fired power stations to be built. Will business invest in them?
It's not any business I've ever heard of. Look, the challenge is that there's very few financiers who would touch it. The only thing is always possible. If a government decided to underwrite it, that is effectively the risk of this coal-fired power station being a white elephant, if I could use that word with the coal-fired power station, in 20 years' time is so high that no business is going to touch that. The government, therefore, might take it on our behalf. Now, I don't think, seriously, the coalition government has any intention of doing just that. I can't see any basis on which a coal-fired power station would make sense. They talk of the possibilities. There is a technology that can work, but it's very expensive. Carbon capture and storage, so that is capture the carbon dioxide from the power station and then bury it underground. You've got to find out where you're going to do that. You've got to understand the cost. And it's still very expensive. We don't need coal-fired power stations in this country. What we need is solar and wind with a lot of transmission and a lot of backup storage.
And does this all go back to the point that business is desperate for certainty around climate policy so it can take decisive action?
Look, that's the bottom line. We've got, as I think I've already implied, we've got a game on. Both sides have agreed what the final objective is, but they won't set the rules. And that's really hard. So what business does then, in the absence of rules, they still invest. Of course they invest, but they invest in things that are more tricky, more risky. They have to put risk premiums on all the costs of what they're doing. What does risk premiums do? It adds up the cost. So it doesn't mean we can't still get to net zero by 2050. What it means is it's probably going to be a lot harder and a lot more expensive and a lot more risky than we'd like to think about. And that's the problem with not having clear rules. Now, most industry doesn't really want certainty. What they want is predictability, because they can make money out of uncertainty if they know how the rules are going to change, in the same way that a football team knows that every year the rules will change a bit, but at least you've got a set of rules and you can optimise your team as you go. Now, that's what the industry is looking for. And sadly, that's what both sides of politics, for complicated reasons, the whole climate wars behind it, have not been able to deliver for industry in this country.
Tony Wood, we appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia.
It seems like a controversial mid-election interest rate rise next week is all but a done deal. 3 of the big 4 bank economists, NAB, ANZ and Westpac, think the RBA will be forced to add 15 basis points to the cash rate, taking it off emergency settings to 0.25%, with the markets almost 100% sure rates will rise on the 3rd of May. The market was inspired by Wall Street session and has bounced back, the All Ords and the ASX 200 adding around 1 1/3% each. And the Australian dollar is under pressure, sitting at 71.1 US cents. I spoke to Catherine Alfrey from Wavestone Capital after the market closed. Catherine Alfrey, we saw a bit of a bounce back on the market today, a reversal of fortunes in the miners.
The miners were led strongly. I mean, this morning we got Fortescue's quarterly production, which was actually about 10% ahead of expectations, and they actually raised their production guidance slightly for the full year. So that was a positive trend versus Rio and BHP's production reports last week. More importantly, we saw some positive news out of China with regards to COVID, with the cases in Shanghai falling 4 days in a row now, and also the issue in terms of COVID in Beijing doesn't seem to be as bad as the market first feared. We also saw last night a speech by President Xi encouraging to accelerate infrastructure spend.
As you say, the concerns around China's zero COVID policy are easing for now, but Russia's attempt to block gas to Poland and Bulgaria could extend to Italy and Germany.
Yeah, now that would be a major significant development, and I think this is typical Putin trying to divide a wedge within the European community, because Poland and Bulgaria, to give you viewers some context, is really only about 2% of Russia's production, whereas something like Germany and Italy combined is well over 15%. So it's very significant if this was to occur.
Well, back to our market, and you mentioned FMG, which had a particularly strong day, but another standout was AMP. Have we seen the bottom for AMP, do you think?
Well, this will be interesting actually, because they've sold their infrastructure funds management business, and that comes on the back of the deal yesterday announced on the rest of their funds management business. So that leaves them now in terms of AMP Bank, which would be their main division here in Australia, and then their wealth management business, which is sort of not making that much money. So the question is in the market's minds, clearly the price they got today was very good, and so the stock price was bid up and they're promising a capital return, so that was well received. So the question going forward is, can the business, sustain a growth trajectory when at the moment the wealth management business is still shedding funds management? Not a lot, but it's still shedding funds. And so then the question is, can the bank grow and the business continue to grow?
We'll see. Catherine Alfrey, appreciate your time. Thank you.
No worries, Alicia. Thank you.
And that's all from The Business. I'm Alicia Barry. Thanks for your company.
This program contains coarse language and content that may disturb some viewers.
Nikita Kulshina was a Moscow activist with the Russian punk collective Pussy Riot. Now she's in Georgia fleeing arrest for defying Vladimir Putin.
My hope is that somebody from Putin's circle just will kill him. I don't know. That's my best wish.
She's part of a Russian diaspora taking flight from Putin's dictatorship and the war they see as a crime. And they're prepared to live in exile to denounce his regime.
I think the moment I go back, I will be just detained by the police.
And inside Russia, we'll meet some of the dissidents risking their lives to stay.
It's a terrible, senseless war, and we need to stop it.
Georgia is a former Soviet republic on Russia's southern border. It's famous for its music, food and wine, and love of life. It feels far removed from war-torn Ukraine. But it's become a flashpoint for refugees. Both Ukrainians fleeing Russian bombs and Russians escaping their own government. These days, just calling Putin's war a war can see Russians jailed for up to 15 years. And since his special operation began in February, tens of thousands of Russians have fled here to Georgia, one of the few places they can live without visas. They include journalists, dissidents, artists, activists, all wondering how they can oppose this war and when or if they can ever go home. You see them everywhere in the capital Tbilisi, collecting humanitarian aid for Ukraine, gathering in bookshops selling banned Russian books, or staging protests that would see them beaten and jailed in Russia. Today it's a commemoration for civilians slaughtered by Russian troops in Bucha.
Вчера, после освобождения Киевской области, русские войска оставили за собой сотни убитых, запытанных, истерзанных, обгоревших тел.
This is the Russian resistance. People who love their country but hate what Putin is doing in their name.
How can it be not a crime? How can killing people can be not a crime? Destroying people's lives, their homes, their families, their future. Of course it is a crime. What else can it be?
Christina left Moscow days after the invasion began, knowing it could be many years before she returns. She's asked us not to say her age or full name for fear of reprisals against her family in Russia.
And I knew that I wouldn't be able to keep silent. And I had a choice. Either I would stay in Russia and go to jail, or I would move to other country and would try to do something to support people in Ukraine and support people in Russia who can't live for many reasons.
Anton Mikhalchuk works for an organisation helping settle the flood of Russians now arriving. He says the Russians here are just one part of an exploding diaspora.
Вообще из России выехало примерно 200 тысяч человек за этот месяц. Это все тоже эмоции. Я разделяю это на категории эмоциональные иммигранты, кто уехал, испугавшись железного занавеса. Кто-то уехал, потому что понимает, что он больше не может развивать бизнес и работу. Ну и, конечно, очень большой пласт – это активисты, журналисты, правозащитники, которые совершенно понимают, что завтра они могут оказаться в тюрьме. И это количество очень сильно каждый день растет. То есть сейчас даже посчитать невозможно, сколько людей каждый день арестовывают.
Vladimir Putin says every single one of them is a traitor.
Но любой народ, а тем более российский народ, всегда сможет отличить истинных патриотов от подонков и предателей и просто выплюнет их, как случайно залетевшую в рот мушку, выплюнет на панель. Убежден, такое естественное и необходимое самоочищение общества только укрепит нашу страну.
While Russians have flooded in since February, Putin has been tightening the noose on opposition for years.
Here it's kind of an empty space now. A lot of
Nika Nikulshina fled here in July, bringing a fire of hatred for Putin that has only burned brighter with the war.
Oh my God, my country go to the war to Ukraine. And I fucking love Ukraine. And also I fucking love Russia.
Nika is a prominent artist with Pussy Riot, a feminist performance group that dared to ridicule Putin and all who supported his dictatorship. From the Russian Orthodox Church to police.
Нужно бороться за то, чтобы в России перестали фабриковать уголовные дела.
The day of the World Cup final in Moscow, she and 3 others dressed in police uniforms to invade the field, stopping the match as the president looked on.
So yeah, I decided just to say like out loud that fuck the police.
Yeah, and you ran out in the field in front of Putin.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you embarrassed him. You made Putin look...
Hope so. Hope he was crying.
Yeah. But that made you a target.
Yes, but it's not a problem for me because I cannot imagine how could I like live in Russia and be silent.
In court, she was defiant.
Борюсь с произволом и с тем, что Россия для грустных. А я очень люблю, когда карнавалы, представляете, сейчас все уедут и карнавал закончится. А я так не хочу. Я люблю, когда весело, я люблю, когда вечеринка.
She kept smiling even after she was sentenced to 15 days in detention. But it was just the start of a campaign to force her to leave Russia. As she continued her activism, she was continually rearrested and thrown back into detention. Finally, she drove straight from a cell to the airport.
So when I was like fourth time in detention center, I decided that I had to leave because I think that I can be more powerful like outside. I can talk from here. Even then I will like just sit in the jail and do nothing. So this was the signal that no, Nika, you're not welcome here, like not anymore. So now I really think that I will not be able to go to Russia till Putin will, I don't know, die, disappear, become a bug or something. So yes, I think we need to wait for his death.
Which could be years.
Which could be years.
When Nika and her friends were first jailed, other members of Pussy Riot made this video appealing for their release. Riley urging police to be good cops, not bad. But one by one, they've also been forced to leave Russia, moving to North America and Europe. Sasha Sufeyev joined Nika in Tbilisi.
So have you left Russia for forever, or what? What's your plan?
Ну, нет, конечно. Я, когда уезжал, я надеялся на то, чтобы максимально скоро вернуться. Вот, но мы видим, что идут месяцы, а ситуация становится все хуже, катастрофически хуже. И пока я совершенно точно не могу вернуться с безопасностью для себя.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been accompanied by a vicious crackdown inside Russia. Since February, the last vestiges of democracy have been stamped out with brute force. Protests have been crushed, opposition figures have been jailed. Journalists daring to question the war have been silenced. Challenging the government inside Russia is now all but impossible. Even individuals holding blank sheets of paper are being dragged off to jail cells. Yet some persevere despite the risks. Our crew in Russia managed to speak to some. Yelena Osipova is 76. Too old and too stubborn to leave Russia, she continues to brave arrest.
Мне уже ничего не страшно. Что мне теперь уже страшно? Уже в таком состоянии. Я 2002 года хожу.
She lives in St. Petersburg, her small apartment filled with her other passion, painting. She has put that skill to work creating anti-war posters. Police keep confiscating them.
Первый раз у меня, когда в милиции украли эти большие плакаты, хотели там. И я так расстроилась, говорит, да не расстраивайтесь, вот, везде есть люди, и русские тоже есть хорошие. Но сейчас просто такое состояние, просто такой стыдоба такая за свою страну, это ужас.
Yelena was born in the aftermath of the siege of Leningrad, when Nazis blockaded St. Petersburg, starving nearly 1 million people to death. Putin has tried to emulate this mythology, claiming absurdly that Ukraine is run by Nazis. Yelena will have none of it.
Но это они же все же придумано. Что там? Что за глупости? И вот это все эти годы. Это же воспитывалось все вот эти годы последние при этой власти. Уже мало кто помнит и войну, и все это. Кто помнит, действительно пережил. Они этого не могут говорить.
Yelena's age gives her some leeway to speak out. Police are less likely to jail or beat her. But she's still vulnerable to ordinary Russians who see her as a traitor. State media have pushed a relentless line that Putin's critics are foreign agents. It's reinforced with non-stop nationalist propaganda, the letter Z an omnipresent symbol of the promised victory in Ukraine. It takes extraordinary courage to push back.
Всем привет, это Таня Фельгенгауэр. Спасибо, что смотрите мой канал. Пока YouTube еще работает, подписывайтесь и распространяйте.
Tatiana Felgenhauer is one of Russia's most prominent independent journalists. But her only access to the public now is making YouTube content from her Moscow apartment.
Депутаты и сенаторы спешно приняли закон о безумных сроках за публикации фейков о военной операции. А пропаганда увеличивает продолжительность зомбо-шоу. В этой ситуации...
Her old station, Echo of Moscow, Russia's last independent radio station, was shut down on March 3. Its signal taken over by state propaganda.
I feel so many emotions. I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm shocked, I'm mad. I cannot spend all my emotions on propaganda. I have to spend it on the truth, on my audience, on the stopping this terrible war.
Tatiana has put her life on the line before. In 2017, a crazed nationalist broke into her studio and stabbed her in the neck. She nearly bled to death. Weeks later, she was back on air. Now she's not sure how much longer she can keep going.
For now, I am in Moscow. I stay here. I want to stay here as long as possible. But I don't know, maybe tomorrow I have to leave. Maybe in a week. But for now, I'm here.
И еще почти одновременно с публикацией этого...
Most journalists have already self-censored or escaped. The news website TV Rain was a fearless critic of Putin's policies. Programs by its presenter Yekaterina Kotrikadze and her husband Tikhon Syadko were seen by up to 25 million people a day. On March 3, it closed down to prevent its staff being jailed, signing off with the outlawed statement, "No war."
Нет войне.
Точно нет войны.
It was the end of independent television in Russia. Hours later, Tikhon and Yekaterina, who was Georgian by birth, fled Russia, flying to Tbilisi to continue their work. Thanks for your time today. I know you're busy.
Thank you.
They have traded comfortable lives in Moscow for the uncertainty and hardship of exile.
This has been the most stressful and terrible moments of my life, honestly, and I think Tikhon's as well, because, I mean, we have decided everything that we were leaving, and we have decided to, to have some stuff and wake up kids in the middle of the night. It was like very fast, couple of hours, and the whole life has changed.
They're sure Putin will never restore what he's taken away.
As a product of the media, he perfectly understands that
those who can control the information control the world. So it has never been easy for the independent media, but last month changed everything.
И, конечно, главная тема этого стрима, этого эфира – события в Буче, жуткие совершенно кадры, которые все вы видели, даже если не хотели, то…
Like Tatyana Felgenhauer in Moscow, Yekaterina and Tikhon make YouTube content from their temporary home in Tbilisi. They admit it is harder outside Russia.
We can report on Russia because we have still people in Moscow and other cities. We have connections, we have friends, we have, different ways of covering the situation, the crisis, the catastrophe that is going on. But still, it's not the same if you leave the country.
Even so, Tikhon has managed to get one interview that outraged the Kremlin.
Известна ли позиция Байдена по поводу миротворцев НАТО в Украине? Насколько это вообще реалистично вам представляется?
He was one of a handful of independent Russian reporters to speak to the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Well, I think he's very honest and he looks very transparent. Like he tells us what he actually thinks. He's not pretending to be someone.
He's not like Putin.
Yeah, apparently.
So what is going on in Putin's mind?
I think he looks like a person who doesn't have access to the right information.
It's long been known that Putin never looks at the internet, relying solely on documents provided by his inner circle. Tikhon Syadko says COVID has left him even more out of touch.
These last 2 years with this COVID, I think that he is more isolated than he used to be because he is paranoid about COVID. You saw these pictures when he met Russian ministers of defense and
Foreign Affairs,
and they are sitting at this huge table, which means that he's more misinformed than before because he only gets information from a few people.
Yeah.
And I don't think he has a... It's hard to have a plan when you don't have any information.
He has lost the connection with the reality, as a lot of people say, and there are some, leaks from inner circles saying that there is a huge problem of Vladimir Putin's understanding the whole situation in Ukraine. And he still is he still thinks that he's winning there.
The mirage is reinforced by Russian television, now almost completely under Kremlin control. There is no news of defeats or casualties, just liberated Ukrainians grateful for Russian aid. Some news reports are just fabricated to suggest Ukrainians are faking atrocities.
Видно вполне себе незамысловато. Двое людей в военной форме тщательно обматывают манекен скотчем и, очевидно, собираются его выдать за труп.
In fact, this was footage from a Russian film set making crash test dummies.
Hey, Christina, how are you?
Christina, who I met at the Bucha commemoration, is doing what she can for refugees in Tbilisi, buying them essentials like food and toiletries.
So you're buying all this out of your own money?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it's normal right now.
But you haven't got much money. I mean, you're not a rich person.
Well, I have enough to live.
She's staying in a cheap hostel, scratching a living as a digital nomad, doing IT work.
We need some toothbrushes, toothpaste. This one is a bit more pretty.
Sweets for kids?
Actually, I think for everyone. Everyone needs sugar. Sometimes people care about kids and they don't care about this much about adults or elderly people. Some snacks. They say snacks help to relieve stress too. Take this and then buy also some shampoos and everything. But But I want to. I'm sorry.
No.
I insist. I'm sorry. I'm very stubborn.
It's the shopkeeper wants to give it for free.
But I know it's hard to keep business, and I actually want to support local business. No fun this.
No fun this.
How much about?
This distribution centre is run by Russian and Georgian volunteers. Refugee families come here to find clothes, food or toys, anything to bring a sense of normality to their children. Daria fled the Ukrainian city of Cherniv as it came under heavy bombardment.
Со своей семьей?
Дочками и собачками, котиками.
Как жизнь здесь?
Не, все хорошо. Тут вопросов у нас нет, очень помогают. Очень много помощи и государственной, и просто люди тоже очень много помогают. Вот, то есть на самом деле не настолько сложно, как нам казалось. Думали, будет сложнее. Вот, но домой все равно хочется.
Most Georgians share the disgust at Putin's war. The streets of Tbilisi are covered in Ukrainian flags and messages of support. But there's a dilemma for the Russian resistance here. The hostility to the invasion can sometimes translate into hostility to all Russians, even dissidents who have fled here in opposition to Putin.
Well, this is an indication of how the Russian arrivals are viewed by some Georgians. There are banners with QR codes to find the best Georgian restaurants, to open a bank account, to find accommodation. But when you click on them, you're not taken to that information, you're taken straight to videos of Russian atrocities with a tagline that it's not just Putin's war, it's Russian aggression.
The reason for the animosity can be seen just outside Tbilisi. 60 kilometres away is the border of South Ossetia, a Georgian province that has been effectively occupied by Russia. Russia invaded in 2008 in support of separatists there. It means Russian troops and tanks are less than an hour's drive from the centre of Tbilisi.
I was here in 2008 when Russia attacked Georgia, and it was terrible, and we understood that he can do it just like that. And he can do it anytime again.
While the invasion of Ukraine has enraged Georgians, critics claim it has cowed the Georgian government. There are frequent demonstrations outside Parliament demanding the government do more for Ukraine. Georgia has been hesitant to criticise Russia and impose sanctions.
That's why we know that Georgian government is not happy with us being here.
Well, they're afraid of Russian President Vladimir Putin bombing Georgia because we are here, because he doesn't like that Russian opposition
exists.
People and journalists, exist, but that they are here in Tbilisi.
Nika Nikulshina has tried to channel her experience into art, expressing the anguish of fleeing her home and losing everything she had. Now she wonders how long she can stay here. She and her fellow Pussy rioter, Sasha Safeyev, have generally been welcomed by Georgians. But she's also found hostility.
Yeah, it happens from time to time.
You walk down the street and you see F-U-C-K Russians written on the walls everywhere.
I still have a PTSD after all that happened in Russia. And now I have it more because like really couple of times I have this not very good situations with like fuck you, you're Russia and stuff.
Я думаю, с точностью да наоборот, потому что если мы берем историю наших взаимоотношений России и Грузии в новейшую историю, то есть последние, да, вот 30 лет, то я просто поражаюсь, как грузинам вообще хватает достоинства не нападать на русских на улицах, потому что...
I don't agree with you. I heard like 2 times like you're Russian, go fuck yourself. I'm so sorry, but yeah, it happened like couple times.
But what worries Nika far more is that the government may force her to leave. Not because she's Russian, but because she's anti-Putin.
In Georgia now, the government is kind of pro-Russian. So we're really kind of waiting like every day that one day somebody will knock my door and, I don't know, bring me to Chechnya and then back to Russia.
So you still have that fear?
Sure, it's kind of paranoia, I know it, but it's kind of like, why not? So it's kind of scary, but Georgia is super cool, and especially Tbilisi is super cool, because this is kind of a lot of democracy here and open-minded people.
At the age of 24, Nika is beginning the life of an exile. Unlike the millions who fled Ukraine, there can be no going home when the war is over. She and the other emigres must wait for Putin to die and hope the Russia he leaves behind will be a land worth living in.
Police say Mr. Justice Opaz was shot with a .22 caliber weapon.
The Parramatta blast shattered brickwork in the forecourt of the empty family court building.
Who premeditated and pre-planned the crimes.
This series of crimes is unparalleled in Australian history.
Len turned around and said, I can shoot you anytime I want to.
The Family Court Murders starts Tuesday, May 10 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
It doesn't change who you are.
The Prime Minister told Parliament he had been
Justice and humanity.
The PM and opposition face more questions about how they'll address long-term cost of living pressures. Gunned down, an underworld boss with a bounty on his head shot dead on a suburban street. The Russian president threatens retaliation if the West interferes in Ukraine. And Targa, Tasmania, rocked by another tragedy. This is ABC Late News. Hello, I'm Pamela Medlin. This week's shock inflation figure is forcing the major parties to defend their plans to bring down the cost of living. At more than 5%, inflation's at a 20-year high, meaning the Reserve Bank is all but certain to increase the official cash rate as early as next week. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
Who wants to read this book?
Labor says tackling the rising cost of living begins with supervised child play.
Labor's childcare policy will reduce those cost pressures on families.
Now we're going to build a little go-kart. You ready?
More affordable childcare, bringing not only a financial benefit,
saving an average family $1,600 a year,
but allowing parents to work more hours, which the Shadow Treasurer says is key to tackling the combination of shrinking real wages, higher inflation and rising interest rates.
Australians are getting absolutely slaughtered by this triple whammy.
Cheaper childcare part of Labor's wage and cost of living plan, along with cutting power bills by investing in cheaper and cleaner energy, fee-free TAFE and university training for higher paid jobs, regulating the gig economy and supporting minimum wage cases, especially in aged care.
There is no magic pen that enables you to write a letter to somebody which all of a sudden sees wages go up.
The coalition still hailing its budget cost of living package.
Designed to grow our economy, to create more jobs and to put more money into people's pockets.
A 6-month halving of fuel excise, reducing the pump price by 22 cents a litre, a $250 payment to pensioners and concession card holders rolling out this week, and from July 1, a $1,500 tax offset for 10 million low and middle income earners.
They will get effectively a tax hike when the low and middle income tax offset runs out.
But Labor doesn't intend extending the tax offset either, so that effective tax hike is coming whoever wins on May 21.
Liberal and Labor are taking pot shots at each other, but neither of them have got a plan to tackle the cost of living crisis.
But soon, Australians will have to decide who they entrust the economy to for the next 3 years. Scott Morrison continuing to urge voters to stick with the one you know in troubled times.
We're in the middle of a global pandemic with a war in Europe.
The war in Ukraine doesn't explain or excuse a decade of this mob going after people's wages and job security.
Can either side stop the squeeze on households? Of course not. One-off payments are one-off, temporary measures are temporary, and Labor's childcare plan would take many months to bed down. And in that time, interest rates will have risen considerably, with next week's expected rise likely the first of several back-to-back rate hikes. As for wage growth, no one has solved the modern mystery as to why it remains stubbornly low, even in an era of low unemployment. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
While the Prime Minister and the opposition leader spar over who has the more effective position on China, ABC Vote Compass reveals many voters think Australia could be even tougher in our approach. The nation's largest survey of voter attitude shows Australians support a stronger line on China and more investment in foreign aid and defence spending.
Australia's increasingly heated relationship with China has become a focal point of the campaign. Foreign policy and our influence in the Pacific is now a key measure of effective leadership alongside domestic issues. Vote Compass asked whether you think Australia should take a tougher stance when dealing with China. More than half of Australians want our government to take a stronger position on China. That reflects a relatively robust view across party lines, but it was coalition voters who strongly agreed that Australia should take a more strident approach when dealing with China. But about a quarter of voters were neutral on the question of how to manage our increasingly fraught relationship with China.
We know that the Australian public has soured on China. There isn't really a public mood for significant change in the relationship with China.
Our level of foreign aid, especially towards our Pacific neighbours, has also been in the headlines after the Solomon Islands signed a security arrangement with China. When Vote Compass asked how much Australia should spend on foreign aid, 45% of voters told us there could be somewhat more or even much more spent on foreign aid. Labor and Greens voters were more likely to support increased aid, but most Liberal National voters disagreed, saying the current foreign aid budget was about right or could be less.
And certainly these results show to me that there's a lot more room for the Australian government to be ambitious on the development program.
And on the question of defence spending, around a third of you told Vote Compass that current defence spending is about right. Close to 40% of voters said it could be higher. Perhaps an indication that Australians are becoming increasingly more alert to our position in what could be a volatile region. To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
As inflation soars, the biggest single cost for households is the house itself. In the rental market, a historic shortage of properties has led to low vacancy rates and soaring rents across Australia.
Veronica Silva is being turfed out. Her home sold.
It's just too hard. I'm crying myself to sleep most nights.
Her new rental, 60 kilometres further away from her 13 great-grandchildren, costs an extra $70 a week. so Veronica will have to cut back.
Food and food.
Across Australia, rents are rocketing, with the rate of vacant homes at record lows.
We have a national level crisis around housing supply.
There's lots of reasons for the crunch, including holiday homes and short-stay accommodation taking rentals out of circulation.
We've seen a lot of investors leaving the market, and then when the pandemic hit, that selling by investors really was supercharged.
Despite our growing population, the number of properties available to rent has fallen by a quarter in the past decade. That's adding to the pressure. Now, borders are reopening.
Supply for housing will be dropping right at the time that demand will be increasing.
This is by far the lowest that we've seen availability and that we've seen affordability. It really is desperate.
The latest snapshot of more than 45,000 listings nationwide exposes how unaffordable things are getting for people on low incomes. If you're on the minimum wage or receive welfare payments, it's almost impossible to find an affordable place to rent.
Every year we say it's tight. This year it could not be tighter.
Housing couldn't be more important to communities, to families, to voters. But dealing with the complex structural problems in our housing market has been absent from the big-ticket items in our election campaign so far. Daniel Ziffer, ABC News.
Political leaders are promising to create more jobs in regional towns, but employers say they are already struggling to fill thousands of vacancies. New figures show a huge increase in the number of unfilled positions outside capital cities.
This mother-daughter team would love to expand their beauty salon in Queensland's southern inland.
Since May last year, we've been advertising on Seek, and we've done promotions on Facebook and just word of mouth, and yeah, it's just been really hard.
Attracting a qualified beautician to the country town of St George is proving difficult.
Finding a whole family to move here when there is opportunities, but it's such a big lifestyle change.
With the unemployment rate at 4%, winery owner David Blackett says regional work isn't attractive when there are jobs going in the city.
Anyone with picking experience would please come to St George. You'll get a job within 5 minutes on any of the farms here. And you know how many applications we've got? Zip, not one.
These businesses aren't the only ones failing to attract permanent employees. In this region, 50 jobs are being advertised right now across multiple industries, but they're failing to attract applicants. The coalition is promising to create another 450,000 jobs in regional areas over the next 5 years. Labor has also promised to boost regional jobs in renewable energy and manufacturing. But in the past 12 months, there's been a 27.5% increase in job vacancies outside the big cities. New data from the Regional Australia Institute shows there are more than 84,000 positions to fill. Most of those are in Queensland and New South Wales. There are thousands of jobs going in regional Victoria, Western Australia and South Australia too. Rural economist Ben Lyons says immigration needs to ramp up again and workers need more housing options.
The government, I think, at a federal level needs to look at incentives to get people to make that move.
There are plenty of opportunities waiting for them. Georgie Hewson, ABC News, St George.
A new system of pay for farm work has come into effect. For the first time, fruit pickers will be guaranteed a minimum rate rather than just being paid based on how much they pick.
In this orchard south of Hobart, harvest season looks like business as usual. But it's undergoing one of the industry's biggest ever changes.
We're being told to compensate or reward low productivity, and that's where it's going to really hurt.
These workers are getting paid by how much they pick. From today, they're guaranteed a base wage, regardless of the amount they harvest. Some growers say the added costs will be hard to absorb.
The cost of meeting the requirements for people who aren't productive going forward is going to be too high compared to the cost for what we're getting for our product.
Industry bodies say those costs may mean higher produce prices.
is likely to be the case. There will be higher cost pressures. Whether that transfers into prices or not is another matter, but there will be a pressure on that for sure.
The new rules are also likely to change the makeup of the workforce.
And unfortunately, it will be a less viable workplace for the traditional casual backpackers, students, semi-retired people who used to come in a few days a week, happy to earn some cash in hand or some money in hand.
That will mean more workers like Hendra and Rio, seasonal workers who treat it like a full-time job.
Someone working hard, someone not working hard, so what the pay same price? I think that's not fair.
It's good, and also I believe that for the whole team it will be good for my team, Timorese team.
Producers, even those who support the change, say consequences are inevitable as an entire industry overhauls its hiring practices. Unions, at the same time though, they say that minimum pay rates have been a long time coming and farms need to quickly fall into line.
So you can still incentivise workers to be more productive, which is good for the farmer, good for the farm worker. Everyone wins out of that scenario. That is still allowed. What this does do is stop those unscrupulous employers, those dodgy employers.
Weeding out the bad apples while protecting those who harvest the rest. Erin Cooper, ABC News.
Sydney's gangland war has again erupted in deadly violence. An underworld boss has been gunned down after leaving a home in Greenacre in Sydney's southwest. The killer or killers remain on the run.
A neighbourhood overcome with panic. The flashing lights a reminder Sydney's gangland war is far from over.
6, 7, 8 are very loud shots. Well, it sounded like shots to me. First I thought it might have been fireworks.
Behind the cars, police desperately try to revive underworld boss Mahmoud Ahmad.
We used to go to school together when we were younger, but he was okay when he was younger, but I don't know much about him after that.
The 39-year-old was visiting an associate at a home in Greenacre when he was struck with a hail of bullets. Watching on in horror were families with young children.
This was an incredibly brazen, callous murder, and it's an absolute miracle that no one else got killed or injured.
In nearby Strathfield, an orange glow lit up the night sky. It was one of 2 getaway cars police believe were used by those responsible for the ambush.
Full of flames, yeah. It was even reaching the power lines, and I thought that the power lines would come down, and I was very much concerned about it.
Nicknamed Brownie, Mahmoud Ahmad was a brother of Wali Ahmad, who was shot dead in Bankstown Shopping Centre in 2016. He was in retaliation for his role in a violent shootout that killed rival Safwan Shabaji. Brownie got out of prison 6 months ago and had launched into a feud with the Alameddine crime network. It's no secret Mahmoud Ahmad had more enemies than friends. Police say $1 million bounty was on his head, and despite repeated warnings that his life was in imminent danger, the 39-year-old would not listen.
He was either going to end up on a slab in the morgue, or he was going to end up back in jail, in a cell. And unfortunately for him, he's in the morgue as we speak.
A gangland war that continues to baffle investigators. Mark Reddy, ABC News, Sydney.
Tensions in the remote community of Wadair in the Northern Territory are at boiling point after weeks of fighting on the streets. Police special forces have been deployed to stem the violence that's left 1 man dead and scores of homes destroyed.
Wadair is a community in crisis. Clashes have now stretched on for 3 weeks. The violence leaving a 32-year-old man dead and an 18-year-old charged with manslaughter.
Kids and mums and young families and things are quite frightened, and people are exhausted, people are upset and angry, and people are embarrassed that this is what's happening in their community.
37 homes have been left with significant damage, hundreds in the community of around 3,000 now displaced.
Those 400 or 500 people basically looking for somewhere else to sleep, some in the bush, some out on country, some in other people's houses.
Traditional owners hope the predominantly younger cohort involved can be deterred from more violence.
In our heart, we feel really empty. What are we saying is, for our people to be strong and to follow the right path for our future.
Police say the unrest is tied to long-running tensions between local families. The Specialist Territory Response Group have now been in the community for a fortnight, the fourth time they've been deployed there since last month.
So there's 4 TRG at the scene as we speak. In terms of police officers, there's approximately 13 or 14, so a total of 17 officers out there at the moment.
Armed with spears, crossbows and steel bars, the fighting is serious. Arrests have already been made, with more expected to come.
TRG been involved in the arrest of 9 members so far, and the arrest of 21 people for warrants have been outstanding.
The government too conceding problems are deep set in Wadair.
We need the elders as well to work with us and work with government there to address those long-standing issues in Wadair.
For those on the ground, the wait for peace continues. Miles Holbrook-Walk, ABC News.
A Sydney court has heard a former elite soldier giving evidence for Ben Roberts-Smith attended a costume party in Afghanistan as a Ku Klux Klan member. The former soldier has supported the war veteran's account of a mission at the centre of his defamation trial. Mr Roberts-Smith is suing 3 newspapers over stories that reported alleged war crimes.
Ben Roberts-Smith's friendships with ex-colleagues are becoming a line of attack. A former soldier codenamed Person 35 has given evidence backing up his account of a mission at a Taliban compound where it's alleged 2 prisoners were executed. The court heard the witness dressed as a white supremacist at an unofficial soldier bar for a 2012 party shown in photographs published last year. I knew one other person was coming in blackface, so I thought it would be funny, the witness said, adding that it was just a parody, just to make fun of the actual clan itself. Asked whether he was reprimanded, he said, "No, I was not. I actually won the fancy dress competition that night." Mr Roberts-Smith is suing 9 Entertainment over articles that contained what he says are false and defamatory allegations of unlawful killings, bullying and domestic violence. Under cross-examination, Person 35's Instagram activity became ammunition. He agreed that before coming to court, he clicked like on a post suggesting the defamation case involved some fuckwit in a suit questioning your integrity, and has previously liked posts labelling Nine's witnesses as rats and snitches. "I consider your client's witnesses to be lying," he said. Nicholas Owens SC suggested Person 35 was an utterly partisan witness whose friendship with Ben Roberts-Smith is so strong he'd never say anything that might damage the war veteran's interests. The witness denied that and said he's told the truth. Jamie McKinnell, ABC News, Sydney.
Vladimir Putin has warned of lightning-fast retaliation if any country directly interferes in Ukraine, in a threat widely seen as a reference to ballistic and nuclear missiles. Ukraine's allies have stepped up support of heavy weapons and equipment, with the first Australian-made armoured vehicles being deployed on the front lines. ABC correspondent Nick Dole reports from the capital, Kyiv.
In central Kyiv, the wives of soldiers trapped hundreds of kilometres away in Mariupol call out to the world for help.
Join the corridor in Mariupol.
The southeast port city is now under Moscow's control. Ukraine's allies have committed to sending more heavy weapons to support the country's fighting forces, including Australian Bushmaster armoured vehicles, which have already been deployed. President Vladimir Putin has issued a stark warning to the West that direct intervention will not be tolerated.
If someone intends to intervene, they should know that our retaliatory strikes will be lightning fast. We have the tools for this, things no one else can boast of having.
Moscow has turned off the gas to Bulgaria and Poland. Ukraine's allies say it amounts to weaponising energy supplies.
Both Poland and Bulgaria are now receiving gas from their EU neighbours. The era of Russian fossil fuel in Europe is coming to an end.
But economic pressure is struggling to put out the flames of Vladimir Putin's war. Towns like Moshun outside Kyiv have already experienced the full force of a Russian attack.
The damage to this village is so widespread that from the ground it almost looks like a bushfire or a cyclone's been through here. But from above you can get a better sense of what's happened. Hundreds of massive shells have rained down on this town, creating huge craters in the ground like this one. The buildings that took a direct hit were obliterated.
Most civilians got out of here, but great-grandmother Lydia Zaker didn't have time. She showed us the cellar where she hid while the shells came down around her. She'd been preserving food in advance.
You ate all this while you were down here?
At least if I died, I'd die with a full stomach, she said. When the guns fell silent, she emerged to find her village empty and in ruins.
After a month I came out of hiding. I saw the houses around me were bombed and burnt. And then I realised I was all alone.
Lydia doesn't want to leave her home. It's been her refuge for the past 2 months. But no one's joining her here anytime soon. Nick Dole, ABC News, Moshun.
The Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House in Canberra has welcomed back visitors months after its entrance was fire-ravaged by demonstrators. To mark the reopening, the original Corridors of Power are showcasing a new exhibition on democracy, with 2 former Prime Ministers attending and a family who travelled across the continent to be there.
If this 95-year-old building could talk, it would have a lot to say, and not just about politics. Most recently, it was hail damaged, closed over COVID and set on fire. Now it's back.
I feel unbelievably excited and happy and overwhelmed that we are finally open after 4 months recovering from fire damage.
The repairs will cost $5 million and it'll be at least September before the building's face is restored. However,
it will be open in the lead up to the election. That will be open as a national voting booth on election day.
Today, the museum hosted a throwback to 2013, awakening to self-proclaimed dinosaurs of Prime Ministers past.
I have actually seen a night at the museum. So, Tyrannosaurus Rex, that's me. Pterodactyl is about to come.
Thanks very much. It's wonderful to be here.
Not keen to answer questions from journalists about the current election.
I'm just not going to get into day-to-day. Would you have done?
The pair opted for a Q&A with school children.
What motivated you to become the Prime Minister?
Democracy DNA, Moad's new exhibition, has tributes for former Prime Ministers. And an empty spot for 2022, asking the question, who is next? Whoever it is, it's someone Jack Green wants to meet with. He's travelled 4,000 kilometres from his home in the Northern Territory to show the nation's capital what mining has done to his country.
That's why I wanted to bring up here, to get people to look at it properly. I'm really pleased that he's up here, but we need to work together and sort of trying to shy from each other, you know. That close the gap they talk about, it's not going to work if they're going to keep on trying to avoid us, you know what I mean?
A Garoa family, now in Ngunnawal country, with a message for the nation. That is democracy. Talia Roy, ABC News, Canberra.
A rally driver has been killed in Targa, Tasmania, just months after safety standards were tightened for the event. 59-year-old race veteran Tony Seymour was killed while travelling through northwest Tasmania on day 2 of the event. His wife and navigator Sandra was in the seat next to him. She received non-life-threatening injuries. The Brisbane competitor's death is the 4th in 2 years.
Just hard to talk right now, to be honest. We're totally devastated.
The person that we lost is someone who's a veteran competitor, and that's very difficult for a lot of teams who are affected by that as well. And it's incredibly sad after what we went through last year also.
The race has been cancelled, but some teams are continuing the course as a touring event at normal speed limits. Now the weather with Paul Higgins.
Well, tomorrow and Saturday, the nation's southeast will have some rain. It'll come from a tropical low feeding a northwest cloud band to bring moisture from the Indian Ocean right across the continent, around that pressure trough and ahead of a cold front. Not much in the way of rain elsewhere tomorrow. It'll be dry over central Queensland. Just a chance of showers elsewhere, but especially on the north tropical coast. Brisbane will have a shower or 2 in the morning. A few showers and storms over western and southern New South Wales and a few showers in the northeast. Areas of morning fog, which which you will see in Sydney, and then a partly cloudy day, fog, then showers at night for Canberra. A sunny morning for Victoria, then showers and storms will spread from the west late in the morning into the afternoon. In Melbourne, 8 to 25 millimetres of late rain. Showers and thunderstorms over western Tasmania in the morning. They will spread statewide, mostly sunny in Hobart before afternoon showers. In South Australia, showers and thunderstorms developing in the south and west during the morning, spreading to most of the state, but especially out here in the east. In Adelaide, a few showers from late morning. Much of Western Australia, including Perth, will be dry. There will be some showers over southern coastal districts, also in the interior and eastern parts of the Pilbara. In the Territory, a chance of showers and thunderstorms across the top end, including Darwin, the eastern Carpentaria and eastern Barkly districts, and in the far south.
And that's ABC Late News. For more news at any time, head to our website at news.abc.net.au. I'm Pamela Medlin. Thanks for your company. Good night.
Building a home causes a range of emotions.
What's mad? Wow.
Some visions are meticulously planned.
Every inch so well crafted.
This is exactly what I hoped it would be.
That is magic. I mean, proper magic.
Others just go with the flow.
Drunken eBay purchase. It's going to be really urban meets rural.
How are you going to do it? Not sure yet.
All new grand designs. Sunday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
It's on.
For the latest on the federal election, go to ABC News Digital.
Policy announcements and how they impact you.
Profiles of every electorate, including yours.
Anthony Green's guide to the key seats.
You Ask, We Answer is back, and you can see what other Australians are asking.
There's our new Get Ready to Vote checklist, plus live blogs and notifications so you won't miss a thing.
For election news that matters to you, go to abc.net.au/Australia Votes or download the ABC News app.
The resurrection of a family that brought the Philippines to its knees.
Absolute power, there's absolute corruption.
Now the dictator's son is poised to be president.
Can't describe the energy that's here on the street for Bongbong Marcos.
The dynasty dividing the nation.
The young ones, they believe Marcos had a good government.
Social media has spread lies faster and further than facts.
Foreign Correspondent, next Thursday at 8 on ABC and ABC iView.
Welcome to the program. Across regional Australia, hospitals are struggling. Some don't have full-time doctors, others don't always have access to essential supplies like antibiotics. In New South Wales alone, tens of millions of dollars are being spent on fly-in, fly-out doctors, and dozens of towns are at risk of being without a full-time GP in the next decade. As Joanna Woodburn reports, these are some of the issues uncovered by a state parliamentary inquiry. It's set to hand down its final report next week.
If you need to have a baby, make sure you have it on a weekday because you cannot have it on the weekend.
We've got cleaners in the emergency department, which I never thought I would ever say, who are sitting with patients who may be confused or demented, and they're sitting with them.
For more than a year, a New South Wales parliamentary inquiry has examined how regional healthcare has failed people living in the bush.
We've had evidence that hospitals are without doctors, avoidable deaths, lack of medical supplies, including blood products, and no maternity services. How do you feel when you hear that?
It's just unfair.
I operated on emergency surgery at 2 a.m. and that surgery took me through till 5 a.m. I went home, I had breakfast, and I was back at 8:30.
The pleas of country residents who feel ignored and abandoned finally heard after some watched their family and friends die.
My mother died alone, with no family present. She would have been terrified.
At the heart of the problem is the demise of the local country GP. 11-year-old Xander Mackenzie was born with hydrocephalus, or a build-up of fluid in his brain.
At 6 days old, he had a shunt placed for the hydrocephalus. He had a feeding tube at that time. Then at 6 weeks old, he had a double hernia operation.
Xander's mother, Kylie, has spent years dealing with countless fly-in, fly-out doctors. None has stayed in Walgett for long.
And have a taste. It's just the constant explaining what's happening. You know, he's not a textbook. We were told that, you know, he may have a 5% chance of survival at birth. Good boy. Ready? Good man.
7 years ago, following a routine surgery, Kylie took her son to the locum GP, concerned something was wrong.
Hey! We'd been home 3 days and I just thought, something not right. So I took him to the GP and he just said to me, look, he's just had brain surgery. He'll be fine. Just give him some Panadol to help him with the temperature. He'll be fine.
Luckily, she bumped into local nurse Janelle Yeomans.
Hello, Kylie. How are you?
She'd been the child and family nurse at the Walgett doctor's surgery when Xander was a baby.
And I said, Janelle, something wrong. There's something wrong. She said, go home, pack a bag, and I'll ring you. I hadn't even got home, and I had a phone call. We go into Westmead.
Hello. Hello, my boy.
He had an infection in the fluid surrounding his brain. So if we'd taken him home, given him Panadol, he wouldn't be here.
Our doctors weren't regular doctors and they couldn't look at him and say there was a change, whereas for me, I had a fair bit to do with him and saw him on a weekly basis. Yeah, and I knew Kylie's instincts were pretty spot on.
Kylie could not share Xander's experience or listen to others at the New South Wales parliamentary inquiry. Because of the pandemic, a hearing was never held in their town. She believes her experience with Xander would have been different if they'd had a family GP.
These are locums that come in, and he was one in particular that asked me, what does a shunt do? And I was like, you're the doctor.
The inquiry has revealed it's not uncommon for hospitals to operate without a doctor on site. In April 2021, almost a quarter in the state's west didn't even have a full-time doctor rostered on.
The kitchen staff receive any special training to do this?
They do their basic life support, I believe, and that's it.
Wow, so you may as well just be asking members of the public who have done a basic life support to come in and check patients.
In many rural communities, it's the local GP who covers hospital shifts. But as their numbers dwindle, hospitals are increasingly only staffed by nurses and doctors are dialed in via telehealth.
At the moment, we don't have a full-time doctor at the Oka Health, but the ones that we do have are fabulous.
Someone in Sydney's East or Sydney's North Shore would not tolerate health care like this. It's absolutely devastating, unfair. They pay taxes and they deserve to have a fair access to health and hospital systems.
Appointments can take a week to get due to the lack of GPs in our community.
There is a lot of work. There's a lot more paperwork. So I think the amount of time that a doctor can spend doing his full job in general practice is difficult now.
At 74, Ian Spencer is on the cusp of retirement.
General practice, I think, is a very difficult career option. I think that the generalist is always looked upon as a lesser part of the profession.
Over the past decade, the number of medical students wanting to become a GP has plummeted. Just 15% of graduates now consider working in general practice, instead seeking more lucrative and prestigious specialities.
How are you feeling today, Pat?
I've got a little bit of a headache.
Have you? Okay, well, we'll check out a couple of things.
When Dr. Spencer arrived in Wellington almost 40 years ago, he was already noticing fewer younger GPs moving to the country.
Thank you.
He's now supported by trainee doctors, and the hospital is staffed by locums.
The hospital component is so overloaded with rules, regulations, discharge summaries, that there just isn't time to do both jobs properly. And so an awful lot of us have had to retire from our hospital role.
Locums can command between $2,000 and $3,000 a shift. Having them staff hospitals across the state comes at an enormous cost. Figures released through FOI reveal almost $67 million has been spent by regional services on FIFO doctors in 2019-2020. And Dr. Spencer's district is one of the big spenders. Nearly $16 million was paid for locums to service a population of 300,000 people.
The cost per shift to hire a locum doctor probably stops the hospital employing 2 or 3 nursing staff.
During the parliamentary inquiry, New South Wales Health admitted its strategy to fix the doctor shortage isn't working. The state's newly appointed Regional Health Minister, Bronnie Taylor, was unavailable for an interview, but in a statement said she's considering measures to attract and sustain health staff and improve access for patients and their families.
What they have to do is address the workforce issues, have those doctors permanently in the hospitals. Fly in, fly out doctors are not the way to go. They need to be part of the community.
The Federal Health Secretary, Brendan Murphy, has warned disruptive changes are needed to fix the crisis. A 96-page strategy lists drastic measures like capping locum salaries and limiting the number of students trained to become specialists, so it's based on demand rather than personal ambition.
I can look back on almost 50 years of being a country doctor, and of all the things that have been tried, it's failed.
Because we don't have the GPs. We have the locums. Really, if it wasn't for the nursing staff that are constant, that actually know the patients, you know, they're a godsend, because it's just a nightmare.
So big.
That story was produced by Laura Cooley, and you can see full statements from New South Wales Health and the state's Regional Health Minister on our website. The election campaign was dominated today by the opposition sharpening its criticism of the government on cost of living pressures after yesterday's bombshell that inflation has soared to an annual rate of 5.1%. Chief Political Correspondent Laura Tingle's with us, but first let's have a listen to the Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers today.
It will sting when interest rates start to go up. We're simply pointing out that if the Prime Minister wants to take credit for things that go well in the economy, he needs to take responsibility for the fact that Australians are getting absolutely slaughtered by this triple whammy.
Laura, what does he mean by the triple whammy? And Labor's hoping to be the government in a few weeks, so what would they do about it?
The triple whammy that Labor's talking about, Lee, is skyrocketing inflation, and as a result rising interest rates and falling real wages, as we discussed last night. I think it's interesting that they're obviously going in for the kill a bit, making sure that people associate this with the coalition, even though the government, of course, has other answers to this. And it's not over-promising in what it will do about it. As he says in that grab, you know, higher interest rates are going to sting. Now, a really big part of Labor's answer here is childcare. And essentially they're arguing that for every dollar put in by government, you get a $2 economic return, because you don't just get a cost of living relief factor for parents, but you get the fact that parents can go back into the workforce and boost household income. So that's a really important sort of part of the Labor proposal to deal with this rising cost of living. They're saying that they can't fix it on day one, but they're talking about policies like training policies, and most importantly, I think the significant difference they're taking on the wage case at the Fair Work Commission in both the aged care sectors and on the minimum wage.
Laura, what's been the government's response?
Well, the government's response is that we're doing better than the rest of the world, which I don't think is of great comfort to people. They're saying that Australia's annual inflation rate might be 5.1%, but New Zealand and Canada, it's almost 7%, and it's 8.5% in the US. So their message is still, look, things might be bad, but that's essentially the really good reason not to risk things on Labor. But once again, one of their problems is that they've had that measure in the budget, which was the $250 payments, which were all starting to be paid today, and the petrol tax cut. But I suppose what's happened with this inflation rate rise and the implication of higher interest rates, it's only really reinforced how transitory those bits of tax relief will be compared to a long run of much higher interest rates.
Laura Tingle, thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
Winning the marginal seat of Boothby in Adelaide's southern suburbs will be crucial to the Morrison government's re-election hopes and equally to Labor's ambition to form government. As Angelique Donnellan reports, the electorate's been in Liberal hands since 1949.
In the Adelaide foothills, these volunteers are collecting seeds they say are crucial for revegetation and the future of the planet.
If you rattle it like this, you can hear that rattle with the seed inside.
This area they're trying to protect is in Boothby, South Australia's most marginal seat. In this relatively affluent electorate, climate change is a red-hot issue.
We have less than 10% of native bushland left in the Adelaide Hills. As a nation, we really need to step up. We need to invest more and we need to protect more natural areas.
I'm a resident of Boothby and I have been all my life. Climate change is my number one decision-making factor when I'm considering where to place my vote.
Oh, excellent. Can I offer you a shopping bag? Oh, lovely. There you go. Yeah.
Liberal candidate and health consultant Rachel Swift is directing her pitch at voters like Sarah.
Climate change is regularly raised with me. I'm pleased that we've already made a commitment to net zero by 2050.
Another lady was talking to me about climate change.
Labor's Louise Miller-Frost is also promising climate change action.
Labor has a 2030 target. It's a target that's been independently modelled. It has policies behind it that show we will get there.
Boothby is commonly described as a bush, burbs and beach electorate, with a razor-thin margin of 1.4% and no incumbent. Some election observers believe the Liberals face a real risk of losing the seat they've held since 1949.
The government currently holds a majority of one seat, so they really can't afford to lose any seats anywhere in the country. So a seat like Boothby is of critical importance to the government if it's to survive.
Good luck, everyone. Eyes down. And your first number is 6 and 0, number 60.
With such a tight margin, the Liberal candidate has to balance the coalition's climate change pitch with bread and butter issues such as the cost of living.
I don't go out much because it's too expensive. It's actually cheaper to stay home.
I never ever thought that I'd carry on about pensioners, but now that I'm one myself, it becomes quite relevant, you know, going shopping and with the food prices. Petrol, of course, is horrendous.
Beyond the fuel tax relief, what is the coalition doing to ease the cost of living?
Well, there's lots of elements to that. So some of them come around housing and making sure that there's opportunities for people to purchase a house. It's also about making sure that people have the opportunity to get into good jobs and plan for their future.
As a former CEO of welfare agency St Vincent de Paul, Labor's Louise Miller-Frost says she understands how much people are struggling.
There's a lot of pain out in the community. There's a lot of hope, but there is a lot of pain.
How will Labor reduce the cost of living for Boothby voters?
Certainly lowering the cost of power prices through our renewable energy strategy. And the cost of living issue is both a wage and a cost issue. So raising the wages will actually also help.
The tight race means preferences will be crucial.
I think the expectation would be that the Labor and Liberal Party will finish first and second on preferences. Most of the Greens' preferences at the last election flowed to Labor, and I think there's every expectation that that would happen again.
Hi there, my name's Jeremy and I'm the Greens candidate for Boothby.
If we in Boothby elect a Liberal representative, we know that they'll be answerable to Barnaby Joyce and Scott Morrison, and we know how those two feel about action on climate change.
Has the coalition got the policy settings on climate correct, or can more be done?
I think there's always opportunity to do more, and I think anyone who seeks to represent their community wants to have a voice on a number of issues. I come from a science background. I'm evidence-based in how I make my decisions, and I'm very good at using that evidence to convince others that we need to make certain decisions.
Independent candidate Joe Dyer is also pitching environmental advocacy and is backed by $20,000 from Simon Holmes à Court's Climate 200 group.
We want to see a moratorium on any new gas and coal extraction. We want to see an immediate abolition of the subsidies for the fossil fuel industry.
Joe Dyer made national headlines as the friend and advocate of the woman known as Kate, who took her own life in 2020, months after accusing former Attorney General Christian Porter of raping her when they were both teens back in the late 1980s. He's consistently denied the accusation.
Nothing in the allegations that have been printed ever happened.
We know Joe Dyer ran for the Labor Party as a pre-selection candidate in Adelaide, has been very vocal on her Labor views or anti-Liberal views online.
I haven't been a member of the Labor Party since my late 20s. I am critical of the government and I'm critical of their policy legacy, and I'm critical of their policy agenda, but I'm also critical of the Labor Party.
Polls indicate Labor could have the upper hand in Boothby, but the Liberals have a track record of fighting off defeat.
I do think there is a mood for change. Whether that's sufficient remains to be seen.
I know if they offer me their vote that I will be the strongest possible representative for the people of Boothby and Canberra.
Sarah Martin knows just how important her vote will be in deciding the seat and which party forms government.
I think the federal election is a chance for us all to sit back and have a rethink about our priorities, and we have privilege to vote, and I'd like to think that everybody will use that vote and use it wisely for themselves, for the general community and for the generations to come.
Australia and the US are planning to bolster their presence in the Pacific in response to the Solomon Islands signing a security cooperation deal with China last week. The fear is that it's the first step to China building a military base on the islands. The Executive Director of the Lowy Institute, Dr Michael Fullilove, has been in Washington this week meeting with senior Biden administration officials. Michael Fullilove, what's the general view in the Biden administration about the China-Solomon Islands security deal?
Well, Washington is consumed by news from Ukraine, of course, but when you talk to foreign policy aficionados and Asia hands in the administration and in think tanks, I think there's a lot of surprise, concern, but also determination for Australia and the United States to do better.
In Australia, Labor is making out, in the context of an election campaign, of course, that this is a failure by the Morrison government due to a lack of engagement in the Pacific. Is there any view in Washington that Australia has dropped the ball?
Nobody said that to me, Lee, although Americans are very polite. I think that they're conscious that they're not without sin. America has neglected, I would say, the Southwest Pacific for a long time. They haven't had an ambassador in Honiara, for example, since 1993. But I would say, as an Australian, we do need to take a hard look at ourselves. And I would have thought, given the historic links between Australia and Solomon Islands and the intensity of our engagement from the Ramsay period onwards over the last 20 years, I'm surprised we didn't have more influence. And it does occur to me, if our arguments are not persuasive in Honiara, then where will our arguments be persuasive? So I think we need to have a hard look at ourselves and work out how we can do better in future.
You mentioned American engagement in the Pacific. Are there any moves afoot for America to have a greater presence in the region?
Yes, I think so. Of course, in the United States, they have the problem of split government, so you can have good intentions from the executive, but you've got to get resources from the Congress. But I think they're looking to step up, to send more diplomats, better diplomats, more aid. I think both Australia and the United States are looking at how they can put a ceiling on the relationship between Solomon Islands and China. OK, the pact is done, but Mr Sogavare says there won't be a base, so can he be held to his word? To what extent can they limit China's presence in Solomon Islands? But also more broadly, because this is not a one-shot deal, certainly, Lee, China would not regard it as such.
What do you think of the wisdom, or otherwise, of the red line remark?
Well, red lines, if you mention red lines to foreign policy people in Washington, they shudder because, of course, President Obama got into trouble for drawing a red line on Syria against the use of chemical weapons. But then when Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons, he decided not to enforce it. I think you've got to be careful drawing red lines. You have to be willing and able to enforce it. And I guess the question that I would ask is, if the Solomon Islands were to ask China, or were to invite China to construct a military base in Solomon Islands, what could or would Australia do to stop that, given that Solomon Islands is a sovereign country and China is a great military power? What could we do?
What are Biden officials making of Australia's election campaign? Joe Biden is a Democrat, so presumably there would be more natural synergy with the Labor government. What's the general view?
I think they're seized of the election because, both because, as you say, you know, fraternal democracies, we have an interest in each other's politics. And yes, sometimes I'm sure there's a sympathy on the left as there is on the right. They're also seized of it because under Prime Minister Morrison, Australia has been seen as the tip of the spear, the most forward-leaning ally in the world probably in pushing back against China, and other countries like Japan have sort of come in our wake a bit. My impression is that they'd be comfortable with both parties in government. I think that they perceive the similarities between the coalition and Labor as outweighing the differences. After all, the whole debate in Australia on China in particular has changed largely because China's changed. So they see the similarities. That's not to say the parties are identical. They've got different DNAs and different personalities. They would run different foreign policies. But I think seen from a distance, Washington will be comfortable with both sides.
We saw the US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in Ukraine this week. Is the US position evolving at all on that issue?
I think here the perception is that Washington's had a good Ukraine war, if you can put it that way. What I mean is that after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which didn't go well, in this case, Washington has settled into a new mode of operating, which is very interesting, leading by example, providing weaponry, intelligence, targeting information, funds, training, but not troops, because there's no appetite within the administration or, frankly, the country to engage a nuclear power like Russia in open combat. And I think they think they've had successes. And, you know, to my eyes, Russia looks naked on the world stage. Their system looks bad. Their army looks weak. Ukraine has transformed its reputation. I mean, now to be Ukrainian is a byword for being clever and brave and charismatic. I think President Putin, notwithstanding, he may not even be aware of all the setbacks that Russian forces have had. I think his initial ambitious war aims remain. So it's hard to see an end, despite the fact that that Ukraine, backed by its allies, are doing much better than expected.
Michael Fullilove, thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
In Papua New Guinea's capital, Port Moresby, 10 young women recently competed in a beauty pageant that's part of an annual festival aimed at preserving traditional culture. This story from PNG correspondent Natalie Whiting.
It is my rightful culture inheritance passed down from my ancestors.
For generations, months-long trading voyages ended like this on Port Moresby's shores.
In the old days, the lakatois was the only transportation that they had because they didn't have any roads. Reigniting the lakato is like, it brings the culture back, it just takes us back in time. Motu Koitabu Assembly is proud to host the Hirimola Festival annually to ensure that the culture is preserved.
Each of the contestants represents one of 10 traditional villages that still exist around Port Moresby.
Our 10 Hanenamos will be judged on 2 categories. That's the individual introduction and the question and answer on cultural knowledge. What are the 3 most popular names for Motuan Lagatois?
The 3 most popular names for the Lagatois are Bogebara, Kevaubara, and Oalabara. Thank you.
We believe that not only are we empowering our young women to learn and preserve the culture, but we're also empowering them to believe in themselves and to use this platform so that they can achieve their own goals and aspirations.
So right now we're just getting her prepared for the crowning.
I come from a clan of Hiri Queens. In this quest, Hiri Hanenamo is something that I wake up to every day because I come from the tribe that my family, my mothers, my aunties were once queen.
Enjoy, embrace it, and all the best.
As well, my tattooist, she's not just an ordinary lady, but she's my great-grandmother. And having her still on rocking like a young girl, I'm very thankful for her.
Each tattoo has its own meaning and they often signal initiation into womanhood. Traditionally, they were permanently applied using thorns and charcoal.
Being born into the Motuan culture and lifestyle, it is that natural instinct which motivated me to participate in this cultural show. And my culture is my identity. If I know my culture, then I'll know where I come from.
I worry about culture because in these changing times, it's fading. And with these events we have, it's important that we have to be proud of it and we have to give all our best in order to preserve it, for it to live on for our next generation.
Each contestant must reenact seeing a Lakatoi ship returning from a voyage, dancing in celebration and alerting the village.
Ladies and gentlemen, the moment we have all been waiting for, the 2021 Miss Hiri Hanenamo goes to Pari Hanenamo, Wojna English.
We all know it's a modern world, but maintaining our culture through these activities and these events, it is very important.